Welcome back to Grimoire Audiobooks. Today, we embark on Part 5 of Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality by Les Wrong, covering chapters 21 to 25. What happens when the wizarding world meets the sharp intellect of a rationalist Harry Potter? The results are nothing short of extraordinary. Prepare for mind-bending logic, unexpected alliances, and a journey into the very heart of magical science. Disclaimer. Before we dive in, a quick disclaimer. This fanfiction is a transformative work based on J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter series. All original characters, settings, and trademarks belong to their respective owners. This reading is for entertainment purposes only, with no copyright infringement intended. Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality flips the script on the classic wizarding world. In this alternate universe, Harry Potter was raised by an intelligent and loving aunt and uncle, instilling in him the principles of logic and scientific reasoning. When this Harry steps into Hogwarts, he questions everything, from the mechanics of magic to the very foundations of morality and human interaction. This fanfiction has become a cornerstone in the Harry Potter fandom, celebrated for its depth, wit, and thought-provoking exploration of the magical and the mundane. With the buzz around HBO Max's announcement of a Harry Potter series adaptation, it's thrilling to revisit a fanfiction that reimagines the original narrative in such a revolutionary way. It's stories like these that keep the wizarding world alive in our imaginations. Les Wrong, a pseudonym for Eliezer Yudkowsky, is a prominent advocate of rationality and critical thinking. Known for their thought-provoking writings on cognitive biases and decision-making, Les Wrong brings a unique perspective to the Harry Potter universe. Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality is not just a story, it's a lesson in skepticism, logic, and the pursuit of truth. So, grab your wands and your notebooks, because it's time to join Harry in unraveling the mysteries of magic and rationality. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. Your support fuels our journey into stories that challenge and inspire. 21. Rationalization. Hermione Granger had worried she was turning bad. The difference between good and bad was usually easy to grasp. She'd never understood why other people had so much trouble. At Hogwarts, good was Professor Flitwick and Professor McGonagall and Professor Sprout. Bad was Professor Snape and Professor Quirrell and Draco Malfoy. Harry Potter was one of those unusual cases where you couldn't tell just by looking. She was still trying to figure out where he belonged. But when it came to herself, Hermione was having too much fun crushing Harry Potter. She'd done better than him in every single class they'd taken. Except for broomstick riding, which was like gym class, it didn't count. She'd gotten real house points almost every day of their first week, not for weird heroic things, but smart things like learning spells quickly and helping other students. She knew those kinds of house points were better, and the best part was Harry Potter knew it too. She could see it in his eyes every time she won another real house point. If you were good, you weren't supposed to enjoy winning this much. It had started on the day of the train ride, though it had taken a while for the whirlwind to sink in. It wasn't until later that night that Hermione had begun to realize just how much she'd let that boy walk all over her. Before she'd met Harry Potter, she hadn't had anyone she'd wanted to crush. If someone wasn't doing as well as her in class, it was her job to help them, not rub it in. That was what it meant to be good. And now she was winning. Harry Potter was flinching every time she got another house point, and it was so much fun. Her parents had warned her against drugs, and she suspected this was more fun than that. She'd always liked the smiles that teachers gave her when she did something right. She'd always liked seeing the long row of check marks on a perfectly answered test. But now when she did well in class, she would casually glance around and catch a glimpse of Harry Potter gritting his teeth, and it made her want to burst into song like a Disney movie. That was bad, wasn't it? Hermione had worried she was turning bad. And then a thought had come to her which wiped away all her fears. She and Harry were getting into a romance. Of course. Everyone knew what it meant when a boy and a girl started fighting all the time. They were courting one another. There was nothing bad about that. It couldn't be that she just enjoyed beating the living scholastic daylights out of the most famous student in the school, someone who was in books and talked like books, the boy who had somehow vanquished the Dark Lord and even smushed Professor Snape like a sad little bug, the boy who was, as Professor Quirrell would have put it, dominant over everyone else in first-year Ravenclaw except for Hermione Granger, who was utterly squishing the boy who lived in all his classes besides Broomstick. Writing. Because that would have been bad. No. It was romance. That was it. That was why they were fighting. Hermione was glad she had figured this out in time for today, when Harry would lose their book reading contest, which the whole school knew about, and she wanted to start dancing with the sheer overflowing joy of it. It was 2:45 p.m. on Saturday, and Harry Potter had half of Bathilda Bagshot's A History of Magic left to read, and she was staring at her pocket watch as it ticked with dreadful slowness toward 2:47 p.m. And the entire Ravenclaw common room was watching. It wasn't just the first years. News had spread like spilled milk, and fully half of Ravenclaw was crowded into the room, squeezed into sofas and leaning on bookcases and sitting on the arms of chairs. All 6 prefects were there, including the head girl of Hogwarts. Someone had needed to cast an air-freshening charm just so that there would be enough oxygen. And the din of conversation had died into whispers which had now faded into utter silence. 2:46 p.m. The tension was unbearable. If it had been anyone else, his defeat would have been a foregone conclusion. But this was Harry Potter, and you couldn't rule out the possibility that he would, sometime in the next few seconds, raise a hand and snap his fingers. With sudden terror, she realized how Harry Potter might be able to do exactly that. It would be just like him to have already finished reading the second half of the book earlier. Hermione's vision began to swim. She tried to make herself breathe, and found that she simply couldn't. 10 seconds left, and he still hadn't raised his hand. 5 seconds left. 2:47 p.m. Harry Potter carefully placed a bookmark into his book, closed it, and laid it aside. "I would like to note for the benefit of posterity," said the boy who lived in a clear voice, "that I had only half a book left, and that I ran into a number of unexpected delays. You lost," shrieked Hermione. "You did. You lost our contest." There was a collective exhalation as everyone started breathing again. Harry Potter shot her a look of flaming fire, but she was floating in a halo of pure white happiness, and nothing could touch her. "Do you realize what kind of week I've had?" said Harry Potter. "Any lesser being would have been hard-pressed to read 8 Dr. Seuss books. You set the time limit." Harry's look of flaming fire grew even hotter. "I did not have any logical way of knowing I'd have to save the entire school from Professor Snape or get beaten up in defense class, and if I told you how I lost all the time between 5 p.m. and dinner on Thursday, you would think I was insane. It sounds like someone fell prey to the planning fallacy." Raw shock showed on Harry Potter's face. "Oh, that reminds me. I finished reading the first batch of books you lent me," Hermione said with her best innocent look. A couple of them had been hard books, too. She wondered how long it had taken him to finish reading them. "Someday," said the boy who lived, "when the distant descendants of Homo sapiens are looking back over the history of the galaxy and wondering how it all went so wrong, they will conclude that the original mistake was when someone taught Hermione Granger how to read." "But you still lose," said Hermione. She held a hand to her chin and looked contemplative. "Now what exactly should you lose, I wonder?" "What?" "You lost the bet," Hermione explained, "so you have to pay a forfeit." "I don't remember agreeing to this." "Really?" said Hermione Granger. She put a thoughtful look on her face. Then, as if the idea had only just then occurred to her, "We'll take a vote, then. Everyone in Ravenclaw who thinks Harry Potter has to pay up, raise your hand." "What?" shrieked Harry Potter again. He spun around and saw that he was surrounded by a sea of raised hands. And if Harry Potter had looked more carefully, he would have noticed that an awful lot of the onlookers seemed to be girls, and that practically every female in the room had their hand raised. "Stop," wailed Harry Potter. "You don't know what she's going to ask. Don't you realize what she's doing? She's getting you to make an advance commitment now, and then the pressure of consistency will make you agree with whatever she says afterward." "Don't worry," said the prefect Penelope Clearwater. "If she asks for something unreasonable, we can just change our minds. Right, everyone?" And there were eager nods from all the girls whom Penelope Clearwater had told about Hermione's plan. A silent figure quietly slipped through the chilled halls of the Hogwarts dungeons. He was to be present in a certain room at 6 p.m. to meet a certain someone, and if at all possible it was best to be early, to show respect. But when his hand turned the doorknob and opened the door into that dark, silent, unused classroom, there was a silhouette already standing there amid the rows of dusty old desks. A silhouette which held a small green glowing rod, casting a pale light which hardly illuminated even he who held it, let alone the surrounding room. The light of the hallway died as the door closed and shut behind him, and Draco's eyes began the process of adjusting to the dim glow. The silhouette slowly turned to behold him, revealing a shadowed face only partially lit by the eerie green light. Draco liked this meeting already. Keep the chill green light, make them both taller, give them hoods and masks, move them from a classroom to a graveyard, and it would be just like the start of half the stories his father's friends told about the Death Eaters. "I want you to know, Draco Malfoy," said the silhouette in tones of deadly calm, "that I do not blame you for my recent defeat." Draco opened his mouth in unthinking protest. There was no possible reason why he should be blamed. "It was due, more than anything else, to my own stupidity," continued that shadowy figure. "There were many other things I could have done at any step along the way. You did not ask me to do exactly what I did. You only asked for help. I was the one who unwisely chose that particular method. But the fact remains that I lost the contest by half a book. The actions of your pet idiot and the favor you asked for, and, yes, my own foolishness in going about it, caused me to lose time. More time than you know. Time which, in the end, proved critical. The fact remains, Draco Malfoy, that if you had not asked that favor, I would have won. And not, instead, lost." Draco had already heard about Harry's loss and the forfeit Granger had claimed from him. The news had spread faster than owls could have carried it. "I understand," Draco said. "I'm sorry." There was nothing else he could say if he wanted Harry Potter to be friends with him. "I am not asking for understanding or sorrow," said the dark silhouette, still with that deadly calm. "But I have just spent 2 full hours in the presence of Hermione Granger, dressed in such clothing as was provided me, visiting such fascinating places in Hogwarts as a tiny burbling waterfall of what looked to me like snot, accompanied by a number of other girls who insisted on such helpful activities as strewing our path with transfigured rose petals. I've been on a date, Scion of Malfoy. My first date. And when I call that favor due, you will pay it?" Draco nodded solemnly. Before arriving, he had taken the wise precaution of learning every available detail of Harry's date, so that he could get all of his hysterical laughing done before their appointed meeting time, and would not commit a faux pas by giggling continuously until he lost consciousness. "Do you think," Draco said, "that something sad ought to happen to the Granger girl dash? Spread the word in Slytherin that the Granger girl is mine, and anyone who meddles in my affairs will have their remains scattered over an area wide enough to include 12 different spoken languages." And since I am not in Gryffindor, and I use cunning rather than immediate frontal attacks, they should not panic if I am seen smiling at her. Or if you're seen on a second date? Draco said, allowing just a tiny note of skepticism into his voice. There will be no second date, said the green-lit silhouette in a voice so fearsome that it sounded not only like a Death Eater, but like a Micus Caro that one time just before Father told him to stop it. He wasn't the Dark Lord. Of course, it was still a young boy's high, unbroken voice, and when you combined that with the actual words, well, it just didn't work. If Harry Potter did become the next Dark Lord someday, Draco would use a pensive to store a copy of this memory somewhere safe, and Harry Potter would never dare betray him. But let us talk of happier matters, said the green-shadowed figure. Let us talk of knowledge and of power. Draco Malfoy, let us talk of science. Yes, said Draco. Let us speak. Draco wondered how much of his own face could be seen, and how much was in shadow, in that eerie green light. And though Draco kept his face serious, there was a smile in his heart. He was finally having a real grown-up conversation. I offer you power, said the shadowy figure, and I will tell you of that power and its price. The power comes from knowing the shape of reality, and so gaining control over it. What you understand, you can command, and that is power enough to walk upon the moon. The price of that power is that you must learn to ask questions of nature, and far more difficult, accept nature's answers. You will do experiments, perform tests, and see what happens. And you must accept the meaning of those results when they tell you that you are mistaken. You will have to learn how to lose, not to me, but to nature. When you find yourself arguing with reality, you will have to let reality win. You will find this painful, Draco Malfoy, and I do not know if you are strong in that way. Knowing the price, is it still your wish to learn the human powers? Draco took a deep breath. He'd thought about this, and it was hard to see how he could answer any other way. He'd been instructed to take every avenue of friendship with Harry Potter. It was just learning. He wasn't promising to do anything. He could always stop the lessons at any time. There were certainly any number of things about the situation which made it look like a trap, but in all honesty, Draco didn't see how this could go wrong. Plus, Draco did kind of want to rule the world. Yes, said Draco. Excellent, said the shadowy figure. I have had something of a crowded week, and it will take time to plan your curriculum dash. I've got a lot of things I need to do myself to consolidate my power in Slytherin, said Draco, not to mention homework. Maybe we should just start in October? Sounds sensible, said the shadowy figure, but what I meant to say is that to plan your curriculum, I need to know what I will be teaching you. 3 thoughts come to me. The first is that I teach you of the human mind and brain. The second option is that I teach you of the physical universe, those arts which lie on the pathway to visiting the moon. This involves a great deal of numbers, but to a certain kind of mind those numbers are more beautiful than anything else science has to teach. Do you like numbers, Draco? Draco shook his head. Then so much for that. You will learn your mathematics eventually, but not right away, I think. The third option is that I teach you of genetics and evolution and inheritance, what you would call blood dash. That one, said Draco. The figure nodded. I thought you might say as much. But I think it will be the most painful path for you, Draco. What if your family and friends, the blood purists, say one thing and you find that the experimental test says another? Then I'll figure out how to make the experimental test say the right answer. There was a pause, as the shadowy figure stood there with its mouth open for a short while. Said the shadowy figure. It doesn't really work like that. That's what I was trying to warn you about here, Draco. You can't make the answer come out to be anything you like. You can always make the answer come out your way, said Draco. That had been practically the first thing his tutors had taught him. It's just a matter of finding the right arguments. No, said the shadowy figure, voice rising in frustration. No, no, no. Then you get the wrong answer, and you can't go to the moon that way. Nature isn't a person. You can't trick them into believing something else. If you try to tell the moon it's made of cheese, you can argue for days, and it won't change the moon. What you're talking about is rationalization, like starting with a sheet of paper, moving straight down to the bottom line, using ink to write, and therefore, the moon is made of cheese, and then moving back up to write all sorts of clever arguments above. But either the moon is made of cheese or it isn't. The moment you wrote the bottom line, it was already true or already false. Whether or not the whole sheet of paper ends up with the right conclusion or the wrong conclusion is fixed the instant you write down the bottom line. If you're trying to pick between two expensive trunks and you like the shiny one, it doesn't matter what clever arguments you come up with for buying it. The real rule you used to choose which trunk to argue for was pick the shiny one. And however effective that rule is at picking good trunks, that's the kind of trunk you'll get. Rationality can't be used to argue for a fixed side. Its only possible use is deciding which side to argue. Science isn't for convincing anyone that the blood purists are right. That's politics. The power of science comes from finding out the way nature really is that can't be changed by arguing. What science can do is tell us how blood really works, how wizards really inherit their powers from their parents, and whether Muggleborns are really weaker or stronger. Stronger, said Draco. He had been trying to follow this, a puzzled frown on his face. He could see how it sort of made sense, but it certainly wasn't like anything he'd ever heard before. And then Harry Potter had said something Draco couldn't possibly let pass. You think mudbloods are stronger? I think nothing, said the shadowy figure. I know nothing. I believe nothing. My bottom line is not yet written. I will figure out how to test the magical strength of Muggleborns and the magical strength of purebloods. If my tests tell me that Muggleborns are weaker, I will believe they are weaker. If my tests tell me that Muggleborns are stronger, I will believe they are stronger. Knowing this and other truths, I will gain some measure of power. And you expect me to believe whatever you say? Draco demanded hotly. I expect you to perform the tests personally, said the shadowy figure quietly. Are you afraid of what you will find? Draco stared at the shadowy figure for a while, his eyes narrowed. Nice trap, Harry, he said. I'll have to remember that one, it's new. The shadowy figure shook his head. It's not a trap, Draco. Remember, I don't know what we'll find. But you do not understand the universe by arguing with it or telling it to come back with a different answer next time. When you put on the robes of a scientist, you must forget all your politics and arguments and factions and sides, silence the desperate clingings of your mind, and wish only to hear the answer of nature. The shadowy figure paused. Most people can't do it. That's why this is difficult. Are you sure you wouldn't rather just learn about the brain? And if I tell you I'd rather learn about the brain, Draco said, his voice now hard, you'll go around telling people that I was afraid of what I'd find. No, said the shadowy figure. I will do no such thing. But you might do the same sort of test yourself, and if you got the wrong answer, I wouldn't be there to say anything before you showed it to someone else. Draco's voice was still hard. I would still ask you first, Draco, the shadowy figure said quietly. Draco paused. He hadn't been expecting that. He'd thought he saw the trap, but... You would? Of course. How would I know who to blackmail, or what we could ask from them? Draco, I say again that this is not a trap I set for you. At least not for you personally. If your politics were different, I would be saying, what if the test shows that purebloods are stronger? Really? Yes. That's the price anyone has to pay to become a scientist. Draco held up a hand. He had to think. The shadowy, green-lit figure waited. It didn't take long to think about, though. If you discarded all the confusing parts, then Harry Potter was planning to mess around with something that could cause a gigantic political explosion, and it would be insane to just walk away and let him do it on his own. We'll study blood, said Draco. Excellent, said the figure and smiled. Congratulations on being willing to ask the question. Thanks, Draco said, not quite managing to keep the irony out of his voice. Hey, did you think going to the moon was easy? Be glad this just involves changing your mind sometimes and not a human sacrifice. Human sacrifice would be way easier. There was a slight pause, and then the figure nodded. Fair point. Look, Harry, said Draco without much hope, I thought the idea was to take all the things that muggles know, combine them with things that wizards know, and become masters of both worlds. Wouldn't it be a lot easier to just study all the things that muggles already found out, like the moon stuff, and use that power dash? No, said the figure with a sharp shake of his head, sending green shadows moving around his nose and eyes. His voice had turned very grim. If you cannot learn the scientist's art of accepting reality, then I must not tell you what that acceptance has discovered. It would be like a powerful wizard telling you of those gates which must not be opened, and those seals which must not be broken, before you had proven your intelligence and discipline by surviving the lesser perils. A chill went down Draco's spine, and he shuddered involuntarily. He knew it had been visible even in the dim light. All right, said Draco. I understand. Father had told him that many times. When a more powerful wizard told you that you weren't ready to know, you didn't pry any further if you wanted to live. The figure inclined his head. Indeed. But there is something else you should understand. The first scientists, being muggles, lacked your traditions. In the beginning, they simply did not comprehend the notion of dangerous knowledge and thought that all things known should be spoken freely. When their searches turned dangerous, they told their politicians of things that should have stayed secret. Don't look like that, Draco. It wasn't simple stupidity. They did have to be smart enough to uncover the secret in the first place. But they were muggles. It was the first time they'd found anything really dangerous, and they didn't start out with a tradition of secrecy. There was a war going on, and the scientists on one side worried that if they didn't talk, the scientists of the enemy country would tell their politicians first. The voice trailed off significantly. They didn't destroy the world, but it was close. And we are not going to repeat that mistake. Right? Draco said, his voice now very firm. We won't. We're wizards, and studying science doesn't make us muggles. As you say, said the green-lit silhouette. We will establish our own science, a magical science, and that science will have smarter traditions from the very start. The voice grew hard. The knowledge I share with you will be taught alongside the disciplines of accepting truth. The level of this knowledge will be key to your progress in those disciplines, and you will share that knowledge with no one else who has not learned those disciplines. Do you accept this? Yes, said Draco. What was he supposed to do? Say no. Good. And what you discover for yourself, you will keep to yourself unless you think that other scientists are ready to know it. What we do share among ourselves, we will not tell the world unless we agree it is safe for the world to know. And whatever our own politics and allegiances, we will all punish any of our number who reveal dangerous magics or give away dangerous weapons, no matter what sort of war is going on. From this day onward, that will be the tradition and the law of science among wizards. Are we agreed on that? Yes, said Draco. Actually, this was starting to sound pretty attractive. The Death Eaters had tried to take power by being scarier than everyone else, and they hadn't actually won yet. Maybe it was time to try ruling using secrets instead. And our group stays hidden for as long as possible, and everyone in it has to agree to our rules. Of course. Definitely. There was a very short pause. We're going to need better robes, said the shadowy figure, with hoods and so on dash. I was just thinking that, said Draco. We don't need whole new robes, though, just cowled cloaks to put on. I have a friend in Slytherin. She'll take your measurements dash. Don't tell her what it's for, though dash. I'm not stupid. And no masks for now. Not when it's just you and me dash, said the shadowy figure. Right. But later on we should have some sort of special mark that all our servants have, the mark of science, like a snake eating the moon on their right arm's dash. It's called a PhD, and wouldn't that make it too easy to identify our people? Huh. I mean, what if someone is like, okay, now everyone pull up their robes over their right arms, and our guy is like, whoops, sorry, looks like I'm a spy, dash. Forget I said anything, said Draco, sweat suddenly springing out all over his body. He needed a distraction fast, and what do we call ourselves? The Science Eaters? No, said the shadowy figure slowly. That doesn't sound right. Draco wiped his robed arm across his forehead, wiping away beads of moisture. What had the Dark Lord been thinking? Father had said the Dark Lord was smart. I've got it, said the shadowy figure suddenly. You won't understand yet, but trust me, it fits. Right now Draco would have accepted Malfoy Munchers as long as it changed the subject. What is it? And standing amid the dusty desks in an unused classroom in the dungeons of Hogwarts, the green-lit silhouette of Harry Potter spread his arms dramatically and said, "This day shall mark the dawn of the Bayesian conspiracy." A silent figure trudged wearily through the halls of Hogwarts in the direction of Ravenclaw. Harry had gone straight from the meeting with Draco to dinner, and stayed at dinner barely long enough to choke down a few fast gulps of food before going off to bed. It wasn't even 7 p.m. yet, but it was well past bedtime for Harry. He'd realized last night that he wouldn't be able to use the time turner on Saturday until after the book reading contest was already over. But he could still use the time turner on Friday night and gain time that way. So Harry had pushed himself to stay awake until 9 p.m. on Friday, when the protective shell opened, and then used the 4 hours remaining on the time turner to spin back to 5 p.m. and collapse into sleep. He'd woken up around 2 a.m. on Saturday morning, just as planned, and read for the next 12 hours straight, and it still hadn't been enough. And now Harry would be going to sleep rather early for the next few days, until his sleep cycle caught up again. The portrait on the door asked Harry some dumb riddle meant for 11-year-olds that he answered without the words even passing through his conscious mind, and then Harry staggered up the stairs to his dorm room, changed into his pajamas, and collapsed into bed, and found that his pillow seemed rather lumpy. Harry groaned. He sat up reluctantly, twisted in bed, and lifted up his pillow. This revealed a note, 2 golden galleons, and a book titled A Clemency, The Hidden Arte. Harry picked up the note and read, "My, you do get yourself into trouble, and quickly. Your father was no match for you. You have made a powerful enemy. Snape commands the loyalty, admiration, and fear of all House Slytherin. You cannot trust any of that house now, whether they come to you in friendly guise or fearsome. From now on you must not meet Snape's eyes. He is a Legilimens and can read your mind if you do. I have enclosed a book which may help you learn to protect yourself, though there is only so far you can get without a tutor. Still you may hope to at least detect intrusion. So that you may find some extra time in which to study A Clemency, I have enclosed 2 galleons, which is the price of answer sheets and homework for the first-year History of Magic class, Professor Binns having given the same tests and same assignments every year since he died. Your newfound friends the Weasley twins should be able to sell you a copy. It goes without saying that you must not get caught with it in your possession. Of Professor Quirrell, I know little. He is a Slytherin and a defense professor, and that is 2 marks against him. Consider carefully any advice he gives you, and tell him nothing you do not wish known. Dumbledore only pretends to be insane. He is extremely intelligent, and if you continue to step into closets and vanish, he will certainly deduce your possession of an invisibility cloak if he has not done so already. Avoid him whenever possible. Hide the cloak of invisibility somewhere safe, not your pouch, any time you cannot avoid him, and step with great care in his presence. Please be more careful in the future, Harry Potter. Santa Claus. Harry stared at the note. It did seem to be pretty good advice. Of course, Harry wasn't going to cheat in history class even if they gave him a dead monkey for a professor. But Severus's Legilimency, whoever'd sent this note knew a lot of important, secret things, and was willing to tell Harry about them. The note was still warning him against Dumbledore stealing the cloak, but at this point Harry honestly had no clue if that was a bad sign. It could just be an understandable mistake. There seemed to be some sort of intrigue going on inside Hogwarts. Maybe if Harry compared stories between Dumbledore and the note sender, he could work out a combined picture that would be accurate? Like if they both agreed on something, then whatever. Harry stuffed everything into his pouch and turned up the quieter and pulled the cover over his head and died. It was Sunday morning and Harry was eating pancakes in the Great Hall, sharp, quick bites, glancing nervously at his watch every few seconds. It was 8:02 a.m., and in precisely 2 hours and 1 minute, it would be exactly 1 week since he'd seen the Weasleys and crossed over onto platform 9 3/4. And the thought had occurred to him. Harry didn't know if this was a valid way to think about the universe. He didn't know anything anymore, but it seemed possible that not enough interesting things had happened to him over the last week. When he was done eating breakfast, Harry planned to go straight up to his room and hide in the bottom level of his trunk and not talk to anyone until 10:03 a.m. And that was when Harry saw the Weasley twins walking toward him. One of them was carrying something concealed behind his back. He should scream and run away. He should scream and run away. Whatever this was, it could very well be the grand finale. He really should just scream and run away. With a resigned feeling that the universe would come and get him anyway, Harry continued slicing at the pancake with his fork and knife. He couldn't muster the energy. That was the sad truth. Harry knew now how people felt when they were tired of running, tired of trying to escape fate, and they just fell to the ground and let the horrifically befanged and tentacled demons of the darkest abyss drag them off to their unspeakable destiny. The Weasley twins drew closer, and yet closer. Harry ate another bite of pancake. The Weasley twins arrived, grinning brightly. "Hello, Fred," Harry said dully. One of the twins nodded. "Hello, George." The other twin nodded. "You sound tired," said George. "You should cheer up," said Fred. "Look what we got you." And George took, from behind Fred's back, a cake with 12 flaming candles. There was a pause as the Ravenclaw table stared at them. "That's not right," said someone. Harry Potter was born on the 31st of July dash. "He is coming," said a huge, hollow voice that cut through all conversation like a sword of ice. "The one who will tear apart the very dash." Dumbledore had leapt out of his throne and run straight over the head table and seized hold of the woman speaking those awful words. Fawkes had appeared in a flash, and all three of them vanished in a crack of fire. There was a shocked pause, followed by heads turning in the direction of Harry Potter. "I didn't do it," Harry said in a tired voice. "That was a prophecy," someone at the table hissed. "And I bet it's about you." Harry sighed. He stood up from his seat, raised his voice, and said very loudly over the conversations that were starting up, "It's not about me. Obviously. I'm not coming here. I'm already here." Harry sat back down again. The people who had been looking at him turned away again. Someone else at the table said, "Then who is it about?" And with a dull, leaden sensation, Harry realized who wasn't already at Hogwarts. Call it a wild guess, but Harry had a feeling the undead Dark Lord would be showing up one of these days. The conversation continued on around him. Not to mention, tear apart the very what? I thought I heard Trelawney start to say something with an S just before the headmaster grabbed her. Like soul? Sun. If someone's going to tear apart the sun, we're really in trouble. That seemed rather unlikely to Harry, unless the world contained scary things which had heard of David Criswell's ideas about starlifting. "So," Harry said in tired tones, "this happens every Sunday breakfast, does it?" "No," said a student who might have been in his 7th year, frowning grimly. "It doesn't." Harry shrugged. "Whatever. Anyone want some birthday cake?" "But it's not your birthday," said the same student who had objected last time. That was the cue for Fred and George to start laughing, of course. Even Harry managed a weary smile. As the first slice was served to him, Harry said, "I've had a really long week." And Harry was sitting in the cavern level of his trunk, slid shut and locked so no one could get in, a blanket pulled over his head, waiting for the week to be over. 10:01. 10:02, 10:03, but just to be sure, 10:04, and the first week was done. Harry breathed a sigh of relief and gingerly pulled the blanket off of his head. A few moments later, he had emerged into the bright, sunlit air of his dorm. Shortly after, and he was in the Ravenclaw common room. A few people looked at him, but no one said anything or tried to talk to him. Harry found a nice, wide writing desk, pulled back a comfortable chair, and sat down. From his pouch, he drew a sheet of paper and a pencil. Mom and Dad had told Harry in no uncertain terms that while they understood his enthusiasm for leaving home and getting away from his parents, he was to write them every week without fail, just so that they knew he was alive, unharmed, and not in prison. Harry stared down at the blank sheet of paper. Let's see. After leaving his parents at the train station, he'd gotten acquainted with a boy raised by Darth Vader, become friends with the 3 most infamous pranksters in Hogwarts, met Hermione. Then there'd been the incident with the Sorting Hat. Monday, he'd been given a time machine to treat his sleep disorder, gotten a legendary invisibility cloak from an unknown benefactor, rescued 7 Hufflepuffs by staring down 5 scary older boys, one of whom had threatened to break his finger, realized that he possessed a mysterious dark side, learned to cast Frigidero in Charms class, and gotten started on his rivalry with Hermione. Tuesday had introduced astronomy taught by Professor Aurora Sinistra, who was nice, and history of magic taught by a ghost who ought to be exorcised and replaced with a tape recorder. Wednesday, he'd been pronounced the most dangerous student in the classroom. Thursday, let's not even think about Thursday. Friday, the incident in potions class, followed by his blackmailing the headmaster, followed by the defense professor having him beaten up in class, followed by the defense professor turning out to be the most awesome human being who still walked the face of the earth. Saturday, he'd lost a bet and gone on his first date and started redeeming Draco. And then this morning, Professor Trelawney's unheard prophecy might or might not indicate that an immortal Dark Lord was about to attack Hogwarts. Harry mentally organized his material and started writing. Dear Mom and Dad, Hogwarts is lots of fun. I learned how to violate the second law of thermodynamics in Charms class, and I met a girl named Hermione Granger who reads faster than I do. I'd better leave it at that. Your loving son, Harry James Potter Evans Bears. 22. The Scientific Method. A small study room. Near but not in the Ravenclaw dorm, one of the many unused rooms of Hogwarts. Gray stone the floors, red brick the walls, dark stained wood the ceiling, for glowing glass globes set into the 4 walls of the room. A circular table that looked like a wide slab of black marble set on thick black marble legs for columns, but which had proved to be very light, weight and mass both, and wasn't difficult to pick up and move around if necessary. 2 comfortably cushioned chairs, which had seemed at first to be locked to the floor in inconvenient places, but which would, the 2 of them had finally discovered, scoot around to where you stood as soon as you leaned over in a posture that looked like you were about to sit down. There also seemed to be a number of bats flying around the room. That was where future historians would one day record, if the whole project ever actually amounted to anything, the scientific study of magic had begun, with 2 young first-year Hogwarts students. Harry James Potter Evans Bears, theorist, and Hermione Jean Granger, experimenter and test subject. Harry was doing better in classes now, at least the classes he considered interesting. He'd read more books, and not books for 11-year-olds either. He'd practiced Transfiguration over and over during one of his extra hours every day, taking the other hour for beginning a clemency. He was taking the worthwhile classes seriously, not just turning in his homework every day, but using his free time to learn more than was required, to read other books beyond the given textbooks, looking to master the subject and not just memorize a few test answers, to excel. You didn't see that much outside Ravenclaw. And now, even within Ravenclaw, his only remaining competitors were Padma Patil, whose parents came from a non-English speaking culture and thus had raised her with an actual work ethic, Anthony Goldstein, out of a certain tiny ethnic group that won 25% of the Nobel Prizes, and of course, striding far above everyone like a titan strolling through a pack of puppies, Hermione Granger. To run this particular experiment, you needed the test subject to learn 16 new spells on their own, without help or correction. That meant the test subject was Hermione. Period. It should be mentioned at this point that the bats flying around the room were not glowing. Harry was having trouble accepting the implications of this. Oogly booglies, Hermione said again. Again, at the tip of Hermione's wand, there was the abrupt, transitionless appearance of a bat. One moment, empty air. The next moment, bat. Its wings seemed to be already moving in the instant when it appeared. And it still wasn't glowing. "Can I stop now?" said Hermione. "Are you sure?" Harry said through what seemed to be a block in his throat. That maybe with a bit more practice you couldn't get it to glow? He was violating the experimental procedure he'd written down beforehand, which was a sin, and he was violating it because he didn't like the results he was getting, which was a mortal sin. You could go to science hell for that, but it didn't seem to be mattering anyway. "What did you change this time?" Hermione said, sounding a little weary. "The durations of the OO and EE sounds. It's supposed to be 3 to 2 to 2, not 3 to 1 to 1. "Oogly boogly," said Hermione. The bat materialized with only one wing and spun pathetically to the floor, flopping around in a circle on the gray stone. "Now what is it really?" said Hermione. 3 to 2 to 1. Oogly booglies. This time the bat didn't have any wings at all, and fell with a plop like a dead mouse. 3 to 1 to 2. And lo, the bat did materialize, and it did fly up at once toward the ceiling, healthy and glowing a bright green. Hermione nodded in satisfaction. "Okay, what next?" There was a long pause. "Seriously? You seriously have to say oogly boogly with the duration of the OO, and E sounds having a ratio of 3 to 1 to 2, or the bat won't glow." "Why? Why?" "For the love of all that is sacred, why?" "Why not?" Arg. Thud. 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 Harry had thought about the nature of magic for a while, and then designed a series of experiments based on the premise that virtually everything wizards believed about magic was wrong. You couldn't really need to say Wingardium Leviosa in exactly the right way in order to levitate something, because, come on, Wingardium Leviosa? The universe was going to check that you said Wingardium Leviosa in exactly the right way, and otherwise it wouldn't make the quill float? No. Obviously no, once you thought about it seriously. Someone, quite possibly an actual preschool child, but at any rate some English-speaking magic user, who thought that Wingardium Leviosa sounded all flyish and floaty, had originally spoken those words while casting the spell for the first time, and then told everyone else it was necessary. But Harry had reasoned. It didn't have to be that way. It wasn't built into the universe. It was built into you. There was an old story passed down among scientists, a cautionary tale, the story of Blondlot and the N-rays. Shortly after the discovery of X-rays, an eminent French physicist named Prosper-René Blondlot, who had been first to measure the speed of radio waves and show that they propagated at the speed of light, had announced the discovery of an amazing new phenomenon, N-rays, which would induce a faint brightening of a screen. You had to look hard to see it, but it was there. N-rays had all sorts of interesting properties. They were bent by aluminium and could be focused by an aluminium prism into striking a treated thread of cadmium sulfide, which would then glow faintly in the dark. Soon dozens of other scientists had confirmed Blondlot's results, especially in France. But there were still other scientists in England and Germany who said they weren't quite sure they could see that faint glow. Blondlot had said they were probably setting up the machinery wrong. One day Blondlot had given a demonstration of N-rays. The lights had turned out, and his assistant had called off the brightening and darkening as Blondlot performed his manipulations. It had been a normal demonstration, all the results going as expected. Even though an American scientist named Robert Wood had quietly stolen the aluminium prism from the center of Blondlot's mechanism. And that had been the end of N-rays. Reality, Philip K. Dick had once said, is that which, when you stop believing in it, doesn't go away. Blondlot's sin had been obvious in retrospect. He shouldn't have told his assistant what he was doing. Blondlot should have made sure the assistant didn't know what was being tried, or when it was being tried, before asking him to describe the screen's brightness. It could have been that simple. Nowadays it was called blinding, and it was one of the things modern scientists took for granted. If you were doing a psychology experiment to see whether people got angrier when they were hit over the head with red truncheons than with green truncheons, you didn't get to look at the subjects yourself and decide how angry they were. You would snap photos of them after they'd been hit with the truncheon and send the photos off to a panel of raters who would rate on a scale of 1 to 10 how angry each person looked, obviously without knowing what color of truncheon they'd been hit with. Indeed, there was no good reason to tell the raters what the experiment was about at all. You certainly wouldn't tell the experimental subjects that you thought they ought to be angrier when hit by red truncheons. You'd just offer them 20 pounds, lure them into a test room, hit them with a truncheon, color randomly assigned of course, and snap the photo. In fact, the truncheon hitting and photo snapping would be done by an assistant who hadn't been told about the hypothesis, so he couldn't look expectant, hit harder, or snap the photo at just the right time. Blondlot had destroyed his reputation with the sort of mistake that would get a failing grade and probably derisive laughter from the TA in a first-year undergraduate course on experimental design in 1991. But this had been a bit longer ago, in 1904, and so it had taken months before Robert Wood had formulated the obvious alternative hypothesis and figured out how to test it, and dozens of other scientists had been sucked in. More than 2 centuries after science had gotten started. That late in scientific history, it still hadn't been obvious, which made it entirely plausible that in the tiny wizarding world, where science didn't seem much known at all, no one had ever tried the first, the simplest, the most obvious thing that any modern scientist would think to check. The books were full of complicated instructions for all the things you had to do exactly right in order to cast a spell. And Harry had hypothesized the process of obeying those instructions, of checking that you were following them correctly, probably did do something. It forced you to concentrate on the spell. Being told to just wave your wand and wish probably wouldn't work as well. And once you believed the spell was supposed to work a certain way, once you had practiced it that way, you might not be able to convince yourself that it could work any other way. If you did the simple but wrong thing and tried to test alternative forms yourself. But what if you didn't know what the original spell had been like? What if you gave Hermione a list of spells she hadn't studied yet, taken from a book of silly prank spells in the Hogwarts library, and some of those spells had the correct and original instructions, while others had one changed gesture, one changed word? What if you kept the instructions constant, but told her that a spell supposed to create a red worm was supposed to create a blue worm instead? Well, in that case, it had turned out. Harry was having trouble believing his results here. If you told Hermione to say oogly boogly with the vowel durations in the ratio of 3 to 1 to 1, instead of the correct ratio of 3:1 to 2, you still got the bat, but it wouldn't glow anymore. Not that belief was irrelevant here. Not that only the words and wand movements mattered. If you gave Hermione completely incorrect information about what a spell was supposed to do, it would stop working. If you didn't tell her at all what the spell was supposed to do, it would stop working. If she knew in very vague terms what the spell was supposed to do, or she was only partially wrong, then the spell would work as originally described in the book, not the way she'd been told it should. Harry was, at this moment, literally banging his head against the brick wall. Not hard. He didn't want to damage his precious brains. But if he didn't have some outlet for his frustration, he would spontaneously catch on fire. Thud, thud, thud. It seemed the universe actually did want you to say Wingardium Leviosa, and it wanted you to say it in a certain exact way, and it didn't care what you thought the pronunciation should be any more than it cared how you felt about gravity.
Why?
The worst part of it was the smug, amused look on Hermione's face. Hermione had not been okay with sitting around obediently following Harry's instructions without being told why. So Harry had explained to her what they were testing. Harry had explained why they were testing it. Harry had explained why probably no wizard had tried it before them. Harry had explained that he was actually fairly confident of his prediction. Because Harry had said there was no way that the universe actually wanted you to say Wingardium Leviosa. Hermione had pointed out that this was not what her books said. Hermione had asked if Harry really thought he was smarter at 11 years old and just over a month into his Hogwarts education than all the other wizards in the world who disagreed with him. Harry had said the following exact words. Of course, now Harry was staring at the red brick directly in front of him and contemplating how hard he would have to hit his head in order to give himself a concussion that would interfere with long-term memory formation and prevent him from remembering this later. Hermione wasn't laughing, but he could feel her intent to laugh radiating out from behind him like a dreadful pressure on his skin, sort of like knowing you were being stalked by a serial killer, only worse. Say it, Harry said. I wasn't going to, said the kindly voice of Hermione Granger. It didn't seem nice. Just get it over with, said Harry. Okay. So you gave me this whole long lecture about how hard it was to do basic science and how we might need to stay on the problem for 35 years, and then you went and expected us to make the greatest discovery in the history of magic in the first hour we were working together. You didn't just hope, you really expected it. You're silly. Thank you. Now dash. I've read all the books you gave me, and I still don't know what to call that. Overconfidence? Planning fallacy? Super-duper Lake Wobegon effect? They'll have to name it after you. Harry Bias. All right. But it is cute. It's such a boy thing to do. Drop dead. You say the most romantic things.
Thud, thud, thud.
So what's next? Said Hermione. Harry rested his head against the bricks. His forehead was starting to hurt where he'd been banging it. Nothing. I have to go back and design different experiments. Over the last month, Harry had carefully worked out, in advance, a course of experimentation for them that would have lasted until December. It would have been a great set of experiments if the very first test had not falsified the basic premise. Harry could not believe he had been this dumb. Let me correct myself, said Harry. I need to design one new experiment. I'll let you know when we've got it, and we'll do it, and then I'll design the next one. How does that sound? It sounds like someone wasted a whole lot of effort.
Thud. Ow.
He'd done that a bit harder than he'd planned. So, said Hermione, She was leaning back in her chair, and the smug look was back on her face. "What did we discover today?" "I discovered," said Harry through gritted teeth, "that when it comes to doing truly basic research on a genuinely confusing problem where you have no clue what's going on, my books on scientific methodology aren't worth crap dash. Language, Mr. Potter. Some of us are innocent young girls."
Fine.
"But if my books were worth a carp, that's a kind of fish, not anything bad, they would have given me the following important piece of advice. When there's a confusing problem and you're just starting out and you have a falsifiable hypothesis, go test it. Find some simple, easy way of doing a basic check and do it right away. Don't worry about designing an elaborate course of experiments that would make a grant proposal look impressive to a funding agency. Just check as fast as possible whether your ideas are false before you start investing huge amounts of effort in them. How does that sound for morals?" Okay," said Hermione. "But I was also hoping for something like Hermione's books aren't worthless. They're written by wise old wizards who know way more about magic than I do. I should pay attention to what Hermione's books say. Can we have that moral too?" Harry's jaw seemed to be clenched too tightly to let any words out, so he just nodded. "Great," Hermione said. "I liked this experiment. We learned a lot from it, and it only took me an hour or so. In the dungeons of Slytherin. An unused classroom lit with eerie green light, much brighter this time, and coming from a small crystal globe with a temporary enchantment, but eerie green light nonetheless, casting strange shadows from the dusty desks. Two boy-sized figures in cowled gray cloaks, no masks, had entered in silence, and sat down in two chairs opposite the same desk. It was the second meeting of the Bayesian conspiracy. Draco Malfoy hadn't been sure if he should look forward to it or not. Harry Potter, judging by the expression on his face, didn't seem to have any doubts on the appropriate mood. Harry Potter looked like he was ready to kill someone. "Hermione Granger," said Harry Potter, just as Draco was opening his mouth. "Don't ask. He couldn't have gone on another date, could he?" thought Draco, but that didn't make any sense. "Harry," said Draco, "I'm sorry, but I have to ask this anyway. Did you really order the Mudblood girl an expensive moleskin pouch for her birthday?" "Yes, I did." "You've already worked out why, of course." Draco reached up and raked fingers through his hair in frustration, his cowl brushing the back of his hand. He hadn't been quite sure why, but now he couldn't say so. And Slytherin knew he was courting Harry Potter. He'd made it obvious enough in defense class. "Harry," said Draco, "people know I'm friends with you. They don't know about the conspiracy, of course, but they know we're friends, and it makes me look bad when you do that sort of thing." Harry Potter's face tightened. Anyone in Slytherin who can understand the concept of acting nice toward people you don't actually like should be ground up and fed to pet snakes. "There are a lot of people in Slytherin who don't," Draco said, his voice serious. "Most people are stupid, and you have to look good in front of them anyway." Harry Potter had to understand that if he ever wanted to get anywhere in life, what do you care what other people think? Are you really going to live your life needing to explain everything you do to the dumbest idiots in Slytherin, letting them judge you? "I'm sorry, Draco, but I'm not lowering my cunning plots to the level of what the dumbest Slytherins can understand, just because it might make you look bad otherwise. Not even your friendship is worth that. It would take all the fun out of life. Tell me you haven't ever thought the same thing when someone in Slytherin is being too stupid to breathe, that it's beneath the dignity of a Malfoy to have to pander to them." Draco genuinely hadn't. ever. Pandering to idiots was like breathing. You did it without thinking about it. Harry, Draco said at last. Just doing whatever you want without worrying about how it looks isn't smart. The Dark Lord worried about how he looked. He was feared and hated, and he knew exactly what sort of fear and hate he wanted to create. Everyone has to worry about what other people think. The cowled figure shrugged. Perhaps. Remind me sometime to tell you about something called Ash's conformity experiment. You might find it quite amusing. For now, I'll just note that it's dangerous to worry about what other people think on instinct, because you actually care, not as a matter of cold-blooded calculation. Remember, I was beaten and bullied by older Slytherins for 15 minutes, and afterward I stood up and graciously forgave them, just like the good and virtuous boy who lived ought to do. But my cold-blooded calculations, Draco, tell me that I have no use for the dumbest idiots in Slytherin, since I don't own a pet snake. So I have no reason to care what they think about how I conduct my duel with Hermione Granger. Draco did not clench his fists in frustration. She's just some mudblood, Draco said, keeping his voice calm, rather than shouting. If you don't like her, push her down the stairs. Ravenclaw would no dash. Have Pansy Parkinson push her down the stairs. You wouldn't even have to manipulate her. Offer her a sickle and she'd do it. I would know. Hermione beat me in a book-reading contest. She's getting better grades than me. I have to defeat her with my brain, or it doesn't count. She's just a mudblood. Why do you respect her that much? She's a power among Ravenclaws. Why do you care what some powerless idiot in Slytherin thinks? It's called politics. And if you can't play it, you can't have power. Walking on the moon is power. Being a great wizard is power. There are kinds of power that don't require me to spend the rest of my life pandering to morons. Both of them stopped, and, in almost perfect unison, began taking deep breaths to calm themselves. Sorry, Harry Potter said after a few moments, wiping sweat from his forehead. Sorry, Draco. You've got a lot of political power, and it makes sense for you to keep it. You should be calculating what Slytherin thinks. It's an important game, and I shouldn't have insulted it. But you can't ask me to lower the level of my game in Ravenclaw, just so that you don't look bad by associating with me. Tell Slytherin you're gritting your teeth while you pretend to be my friend. That was exactly what Draco had told Slytherin, and he still wasn't sure whether it was true. Anyway, Draco said, speaking of your image, I'm afraid I've got some bad news. Rita Skeeter heard some of the stories about you, and she's been asking questions. Harry Potter raised his eyebrows.
Who?
She writes for the Daily Prophet, Draco said. He tried to keep the worry out of his voice. The Daily Prophet was one of Father's primary tools. He used it like a wizard's wand. That's the newspaper people actually pay attention to. Rita Skeeter writes about celebrities, and as she puts it, uses her quill to puncture their overinflated reputations. If she can't find any rumors about you, she'll just make up her own. I see, said Harry Potter. His greenlit face looked very thoughtful beneath the cowl. Draco hesitated before saying what he had to say next. By now someone had certainly reported to Father that he was courting Harry Potter, and Father would also know that Draco hadn't written home about it, and Father would understand that Draco didn't think he could actually keep it a secret, which sent a clear message that Draco was practicing his own game now but still on Father's side, since if Draco had been tempted away, he would have been sending false reports. It followed that Father had probably anticipated what Draco was about to say next. Playing the game with Father for real was a rather unnerving sensation, even if they were on the same side. It was, on the one hand, exhilarating, but Draco also knew that in the end it would turn out that Father had played the game better. There was no other way it could possibly go. Harry, Draco finally said, this isn't a suggestion. This isn't my advice. Just the way it is. My father could almost certainly quash that article. But it would cost you. That father had been expecting Draco to tell Harry Potter exactly. That was not something Draco said out loud. Harry Potter would work it out on his own, or not. But instead Harry Potter shook his head, smiling beneath the cowl. I have no intention of trying to quash Rita Skeeter. Draco didn't even try to keep the incredulity out of his voice. You can't tell me you don't care what the newspaper says about you. I care less than you might think, said Harry Potter. But I have my own ways of dealing with the likes of Skeeter. I don't need Lucius's help. A worried look came over Draco's face before he could stop it. Whatever Harry Potter was about to do next, it would be something Father wasn't expecting, and Draco was feeling very nervous about where that might lead. Draco also realized that his hair was getting sweaty underneath the cowl. He'd never actually worn one of those before, and hadn't realized that the Death Eater's cloaks probably had things like cooling charms. Harry Potter wiped some sweat from his forehead again, grimaced, took out his wand, pointed it upward, took a deep breath, and said, Frigidero. Moments later Draco felt the cold draft. Frigidero. 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 Then Harry Potter lowered the wand, though his hand seemed a bit shaky, and put it back into his robes. The whole room seemed perceptibly cooler. Draco could have done that too, but still, not bad. So, Draco said, Science. You're going to tell me about blood. We're going to find out about blood, Harry Potter said. By doing experiments. All right, Draco said. What sort of experiments? Harry Potter smiled evilly beneath his cowl and said, You tell me. Draco had heard of something called the Socratic method, which was teaching by asking questions, named after an ancient philosopher who had been too smart to be a real muggle and hence had been a disguised pure-blood wizard. One of his tutors had used Socratic teaching a lot. It had been annoying, but effective. Then there was the Potter method, which was insane. To be fair, Draco had to admit that Harry Potter had tried the Socratic method first, and it hadn't been working too well. Harry Potter had asked how Draco would go about disproving the blood purist hypothesis that wizards couldn't do the neat stuff now that they'd done 8 centuries ago because they had interbred with Muggleborns and Squibs. Draco had said that he did not understand how Harry Potter could sit there with a straight face and claim this was not a trap. Harry Potter had replied, still with a straight face, that if it was a trap it would have been so pathetically obvious that he ought to be ground up and fed to pet snakes, but it was not a trap. It was simply a rule of how scientists operated that you had to try to disprove your own theories, and if you made an honest effort and failed, that was victory. Draco had tried to point out the staggering stupidity of this by suggesting that the key to surviving a duel was to cast Avada Kedavra on your own foot and miss. Harry Potter had nodded. Draco had shaken his head. Harry Potter had then presented the idea that scientists watched ideas fight to see which ones won, and you couldn't fight without an opponent, so Draco needed to figure out opponents for the blood purist hypothesis to fight so that blood purism could win, which Draco understood a little better, even though Harry Potter had said it with a rather distasteful look. Like, it was clear that if blood purism was the way the world really was, then the sky just had to be blue, and if some other theory was true, the sky just had to be green. And nobody had seen the sky yet, and then you went outside and looked, and the blood purists won. And after this had happened 6 times in a row, people would start noticing the trend. Harry Potter had then proceeded to claim that all the opponents Draco was inventing were too weak, so blood purism wouldn't get credit for defeating them because the battle wouldn't be impressive enough. Draco had understood that too. Wizards have gotten weaker, because house elves are stealing our magic hadn't sounded impressive to him either. Though Harry Potter had said that one at least was testable, in that they could try to check if house elves had gotten stronger over time, and even draw a picture representing the increasing strength of house elves and another picture representing the decreasing strength of wizards, and if the two pictures matched, that would point to the house elves. All said in such completely serious tones that Draco had felt an impulse to ask Dobby a few pointed questions under Veritaserum before snapping out of it. And Harry Potter had finally said that Draco couldn't fix the battle. Scientists weren't dumb. It would be obvious if you fix the battle. It had to be a real fight between two different theories that might both really be true, with a test that only the true hypothesis would win, something that actually would come out different ways depending on which hypothesis was actually correct. And there would be experienced scientists watching to make sure that was exactly what happened. Harry Potter had claimed that he himself just wanted to know how blood really worked, and for that he needed to see blood purism really win, and Draco wasn't going to fool him with theories that were just there to be knocked down. Even having seen the point, Draco hadn't been able to invent any plausible alternatives, as Harry Potter put it, to the idea that wizards were getting less powerful because they were mixing their blood with mud. It was too obviously true. It was then that Harry Potter had said, rather frustrated, that he couldn't imagine Draco was really this bad at considering different viewpoints. Surely there'd been Death Eaters who'd posed as enemies of blood purism and had come up with much more plausible-sounding arguments against their own side than Draco was offering. If Draco had been trying to pose as a member of Dumbledore's faction and come up with the house elf hypothesis, he wouldn't have fooled anyone for a second. Draco had been forced to admit this was a point. Hence the Potter method. "Please, Dr. Malfoy," whined Harry Potter, "why won't you accept my papers?" Harry Potter had needed to repeat the phrase, "just pretend to be pretending to be a scientist," 3 times before Draco had understood. In that moment, Draco had realized that there was something deeply wrong with Harry Potter's brain, and anyone who tried legitimacy on it would probably never come back out again. Harry Potter had then gone into further and considerable detail. Draco was to pretend to be a Death Eater who was posing as the editor of a scientific journal, Dr. Malfoy, who wanted to reject his enemy Dr. Potter's paper on the heritability of magical ability, and if the Death Eater didn't act like a real scientist would, he would be revealed as a Death Eater and executed. While Dr. Malfoy was also being watched by his own rivals and needed to appear to reject Dr. Potter's paper for neutral scientific reasons, or he would lose his position as journal editor. It was a wonder the Sorting Hat wasn't gibbering madly in St. Mungo's. It was also the most complicated thing anyone had ever asked Draco to pretend, and there was no possible way he could have refused the challenge. Right now they were, as Harry Potter had put it, getting in the mood. "I'm afraid, Dr. Potter, that you wrote this in the wrong color of ink," Draco said. "Next." Dr. Potter's face did an excellent job of crumpling in despair, and Draco couldn't help but feel a flash of Dr. Malfoy's glee, even though the Death Eater was only pretending to be Dr. Malfoy. This part was fun. He could have done this all day long. Dr. Potter got up from the chair, slumped over in dismay, and trudged off, and turned into Harry Potter, who gave Draco a thumbs up, and then turned back into Dr. Potter again, now approaching with an eager smile. Dr. Potter sat down and presented Dr. Malfoy with a piece of parchment on which was written, "On the heritability of magical ability. Dr. H. J. Potter Evans Bears, Institute for Sufficiently Advanced Science. My observation. Today's wizards can't do things as impressive as what wizards used to do 800 years ago. My conclusion. Wizard kind has become weaker by mixing their blood with muggleborns and squibs. Dr. Malfoy, said Dr. Potter with a hopeful look, I was wondering if the Journal of Irreproducible Results could consider for publication my paper entitled On the Heritability of Magical Ability. Draco looked at the parchment, smiling while he considered possible rejections. If he was a professor, he would have refused the essay as too short. So, it's too long, Dr. Potter, said Dr. Malfoy. For a moment there was genuine incredulity on Dr. Potter's face. Ah, said Dr. Potter. How about if I get rid of the separate lines for observations and conclusions, and just put in a therefore dash? Then it'll be too short. Next. Dr. Potter trudged off. All right, said Harry Potter, you're getting too good at this. 2 more times to practice. And then 3rd time is for real, no interruptions between. I'll just come in straight at you, and that time you'll reject the paper based on the actual content. Remember, your scientific rivals are watching. Dr. Potter's next paper was perfect in every way, a marvel of its kind, but unfortunately had to be rejected because Dr. Malfoy's journal was having trouble with the letter each. Dr. Potter offered to rewrite it without those words, and Dr. Malfoy explained that it was really more of a vowel problem. The paper after that was rejected because it was Tuesday. It was, in fact, Saturday. Dr. Potter tried to point this out and was told next. Draco was starting to understand why Snape had used his hold over Dumbledore just to get a position that let him be awful to students. And then, Dr. Potter was approaching with a superior smirk on his face. This is my latest paper, on the heritability of magical ability, Dr. Potter stated confidently, and thrust out the parchment. I have decided to allow your journal to publish it, and have prepared it in perfect accordance with your guidelines so that you may publish it quickly. The Death Eater decided to track down and kill Dr. Potter after his mission was done. Dr. Malfoy kept a polite smile on his face, since his rivals were watching, and said, the pause stretched, with Dr. Potter looking at him impatiently. Let me look at that, please. Dr. Malfoy took the parchment and perused it carefully. The Death Eater was starting to get nervous about the fact that he wasn't a real scientist, and Draco was trying to remember how to talk like Harry Potter. You, need to consider other possible explanations for your, observation, besides just this one dash. Really? Interrupted Dr. Potter. Like what, exactly? House elves are stealing our magic? My data admit of only one possible conclusion, Dr. Malfoy. There are no other plausible hypotheses. Draco was trying furiously to order his brain to think. What would he say if he was posing as a member of Dumbledore's faction? What did they claim was the explanation for Wizardkin's decline? Draco had never bothered to actually ask that. If you can't think of any other way to explain my data, you'll have to publish my paper, Dr. Malfoy. It was the sneer on Dr. Potter's face that did it. Oh yeah, snapped Dr. Malfoy. How do you know that magic itself isn't fading away? Time stopped. Draco and Harry Potter exchanged looks of appalled horror. Then Harry Potter spat something that was probably an extremely bad word if you'd been raised by muggles. I didn't think of that, said Harry Potter. And I should have. The magic goes away. Damn, damn, damn. The alarm in Harry Potter's voice was contagious. Without even thinking about it, Draco's hand went into his robes and clutched at his wand. He'd thought the House of Malfoy was safe, So long as you only married into families that could trace their bloodlines back 4 generations, you were supposed to be safe. It had never occurred to him before that there might be nothing anyone could do to stop the end of magic. Harry, what do we do? Draco's voice was rising in panic. What do we do? Let me think. After a few moments, Harry grabbed from a nearby desk the same quill and roll of parchment he'd used to write his pretend paper and started scribbling something. We'll figure it out, Harry said, his voice tight. If magic is fading out of the world, we'll figure out how fast it's fading and how much time we have left to do something, and then we'll figure out why it's fading, and then we'll do something about it. Draco, have wizarding powers been declining at a steady rate, or have there been sudden drops?
I
don't know. You told me that no one had matched the 4 founders of Hogwarts. So it's been going on for at least 8 centuries, then? You can't remember hearing anything about the problem suddenly appearing 5 centuries ago, or anything like that? Draco was trying frantically to think. I always heard that nobody was as good as Merlin, and then after that nobody was as good as the founders of Hogwarts. All right, Harry said. He was still scribbling. Because 3 centuries ago is when Muggles started to not believe in magic, which I thought might have something to do with it. And about 1.5 centuries ago was when Muggles began using a kind of technology that stops working around magic, and I was wondering if it might also go the other way around. Draco exploded out of his chair, so angry he could hardly even speak. It's the Muggles, dash. Damn it, roared Harry. Weren't you even listening to yourself? It's been going on for 8 centuries at least, and the Muggles weren't doing anything interesting then. We have to figure out the real truth. The Muggles might have something to do with this, but if they don't and you go blaming everything on them, and that stops us from figuring out what's really going on, then one day you're going to wake up in the morning and find out that your wand is just a stick of wood. Draco's breath stopped in his throat. His father often said our wands will break in our hands in his speeches, but Draco had never really thought before about what that meant. It wasn't going to happen to him after all. And now suddenly it seemed very real. Just a stick of wood. Draco could imagine just what it would be like to take out his wand and try to cast a spell and find that nothing was happening. That could happen to everyone. There would be no more wizards, no more magic, ever. Just Muggles who had a few legends about what their ancestors had been able to do. Some of the Muggles would be called Malfoy, and that would be all that was left of the name. For the first time in his life, Draco realized why there were Death Eaters. He'd always taken for granted that becoming a Death Eater was something you did when you grew up. Now Draco understood. He knew why Father and Father's friends had sworn to give their lives to prevent the nightmare from coming to pass. There were things you couldn't just stand by and watch happen. But what if it was going to happen anyway? What if all the sacrifices, all the friends they'd lost to Dumbledore, the family they'd lost, what if it had all been for nothing? Magic can't be fading away, Draco said. His voice was breaking. It wouldn't be fair. Harry stopped scribbling and looked up. His face had an angry expression. Your father never told you that life isn't fair? Father had said that every single time Draco used the word. But, it's too awful to believe that, dash. Draco, let me introduce you to something I call the Litany of Tarski. It changes every time you use it. On this occasion, it runs like so. If magic is fading out of the world, I want to believe that magic is fading out of the world. If magic is not fading out of the world, I want not to believe that magic is fading out of the world. Let me not become attached to beliefs I may not want. If we're living in a world where magic is fading, That's what we have to believe. We have to know what's coming, so we can stop it, or in the very worst case, be prepared to do what we can in the time we have left. Not believing it won't stop it from happening. So the only question we have to ask is whether magic is actually fading, and if that's the world we live in, then that's what we want to believe. Litany of Junlin. What's true is already so. Owning up to it doesn't make it worse. Got that, Draco? I'm going to make you memorize it later. It's something you repeat to yourself anytime you start wondering if it's a good idea to believe something that isn't actually true. In fact, I want you to say it right now. What's true is already so. Owning up to it doesn't make it worse.
Say it.
What's true is already so, repeated Draco, his voice trembling. Owning up to it doesn't make it worse. If magic is fading, I want to believe that magic is fading. If magic is not fading, I want not to believe that magic is fading. Say it. Draco repeated back the words, the sickness churning in his stomach. Good, Harry said. Remember, it might not be happening, and then you won't have to believe it either. First, we just want to know what's actually going on, which world we actually live in. Harry turned back to his work, scribbled some more, and then turned the parchment so Draco could see it. Draco leaned over the desk, and Harry brought the green light closer. Observation. Wizardry isn't as powerful now as it was when Hogwarts was founded. Hypotheses. 1. Magic itself is fading. 2. Wizards are interbreeding with muggles and squibs. 3. Knowledge to cast powerful spells is being lost. 4. Wizards are eating the wrong foods as children, or something else besides blood is making them grow up weaker. 5. Muggle technology is interfering with magic. Since 800 years ago. 6. Stronger wizards are having fewer children. Draco equals only child? Check if 3 powerful wizards, Quirrell/Dumbledore/Dark Lord, had any children. Tests. All right, Harry said. His breathing sounded a little calmer. Now, when you're dealing with a confusing problem and you have no idea what's going on, the smart thing to do is figure out some really simple tests, things you can look at right away. We need fast tests that distinguish between these hypotheses. Observations that would come out a different way for at least one of them compared to all the other ones. Draco stared at the list in shock. He was suddenly realizing that he knew an awful lot of purebloods who were only children. Himself, Vincent, Gregory, practically everyone. The 2 most powerful wizards everyone talked about were Dumbledore and the Dark Lord, and neither had any children, just like Harry had suspected. It's going to be really hard to distinguish between 2 and 6, Harry said. It's in the blood either way. You have to try and track the decline of wizardry, and compare that to how many kids different wizards were having, and measure the abilities of Muggleborns compared to purebloods. Harry's fingers were tapping nervously on the desk. Let's just lump 6 in with 2, and call them the blood hypothesis for now. For is unlikely because then everyone would notice a sudden drop when the wizards switched to new foods. It's hard to see what would have changed steadily over 800 years. 5 is unlikely for the same reason, no sudden drop. Muggles weren't doing anything 800 years back. For looks like 2, and 5 looks like 1 anyway. So mainly we should be trying to distinguish between 1, 2, and 3. Harry turned the parchment himself, drew an ellipse around those 3 numbers, turned it back. Magic is fading. Blood is weakening. Knowledge is disappearing. What test comes out differently depending on which of those is true? What could we see that would mean any one of these was false? I don't know, blurted Draco. Why are you asking me? You're the scientist. Draco, Harry said, a note of pleading desperation in his voice. I only know what Muggle scientists know. You grew up in the wizarding world, I didn't. You know more magic than I do, and you know more about magic than I do, and you thought of this whole idea in the first place. So start thinking like a scientist and solve this. Draco swallowed hard and stared at the paper. Magic is fading. Wizards are interbreeding with Muggles. Knowledge is being lost. What does the world look like if magic is fading? Said Harry Potter. You know more about magic. You should be the one guessing, not me. Imagine you're telling a story about it. What happens in the story? Draco imagined it. Charms that used to work stop working. Wizards wake up and find that their wands are sticks of wood. What does the world look like if the wizarding blood gets weaker? People can't do things their ancestors could do. What does the world look like if knowledge is being lost? People don't know how to cast the charms in the first place, said Draco. He stopped, surprised at himself. That's a test, isn't it? Harry nodded decisively. That's one. He wrote it down on the parchment under tests. A. Are there spells we know but can't cast, 1 or 2? Or, are the lost spells no longer known, 3? So that distinguishes between 1 and 2 on the one hand, and 3 on the other hand, said Harry. Now we need some way to distinguish between 1 and 2. Magic fading, blood weakening. How could we tell the difference? What kind of charms did students use to cast in their first year at Hogwarts? Said Draco. If they used to be able to cast much more powerful charms, the blood was stronger dash. Harry Potter shook his head. Or magic itself was stronger. We have to figure out some way of telling the difference. Harry stood up from his chair, began pacing nervously through the classroom. No, wait. That might still work. Suppose different spells use up different amounts of magical energy. Then if the ambient magic weakened, the powerful spells would die first, but the spells everyone learns in their first year would stay the same. Harry's nervous pacing sped up. It's not a very good test. It's more about powerful wizardry being lost versus all wizardry being lost. Someone's blood could be too weak for powerful wizardry, but strong enough for easy spells. Draco, do you know if more powerful wizards within a single era, like powerful wizards from just this century, are more powerful as children? If the Dark Lord had cast the cooling charm when he was 11, could he have frozen the whole room? Draco's face screwed up as he tried to recollect. I can't remember hearing anything about the Dark Lord, but I think Dumbledore's supposed to have done something amazing on his Transfiguration OWLS in 5th year. I think other powerful wizards were good in Hogwarts, too. Harry scowled, still pacing. They could just be studying hard. Still, if first-year students learn the same spells and seemed about as powerful then as now, we could call that weak evidence favoring 1/2. Wait, hold on. Harry stopped where he stood. I have another test that might distinguish between 1 and 2. It would take a while to explain. It uses some things that scientists know about blood and inheritance, but it's an easy question to ask. And if we combine my test and your test, and they both come out the same way, that's a strong hint at the answer. Harry almost ran back to the desk, took the parchment, and wrote. B. Did ancient first-year students cast the same sort of spells, with the same power as now? Weak evidence for 1/2, but blood could also be losing powerful wizardry only. C. Additional test that distinguishes 1 and 2 using scientific knowledge of blood. We'll explain later. Okay, said Harry, We can at least try to tell the difference between 1 and 2 and 3, so let's go with this right away. We can figure out more tests after we do the ones we already have. Now it's going to look a little odd if Draco Malfoy and Harry Potter go around asking questions together. So here's my idea. You'll go through Hogwarts and find old portraits and ask them about what spells they learned to cast during their first years. They're portraits, so they won't know there's anything odd about Draco Malfoy doing that. I'll ask recent portraits and living people about spells we know but can't cast. No one will notice anything unusual if Harry Potter asks weird questions. And I'll have to do complicated research about forgotten spells, so I want you to be the one to gather the data I need for my own scientific question. It's a simple question, and you should be able to find the answer by asking portraits. You might want to write this down. Ready? Draco sat down again and scrabbled in his book bag for parchment and quill. When it was laid down on the desk, Draco looked up, face determined. Go ahead. Find portraits who knew a married squib couple. Don't make that face, Draco. It's important information. Just ask recent portraits who are Gryffindors or something. Find portraits who knew a married squib couple well enough to know the names of all their children. Write down the name of each child and whether that child was a wizard, a squib, or a muggle. If they don't know whether the child was a squib or a muggle, write down non-wizard. Write that down for every child the couple had. Don't leave any out. If the portrait only knows the name of the wizarding children, not the names of all the children, then don't write down any data from that couple. It's very important that you only bring me data from someone who knows all the children a squib couple had, well enough to know them all by name. Try to get at least 40 names total if you can, and if you have time for more, even better. Have you got all that? Repeat it, Draco said when he was done writing, and Harry repeated it. I've got it, Draco said, but why dash? It has to do with one of the secrets of blood that scientists already discovered. I'll explain when you get back. Let's split up and meet back here in an hour, 6:22 p.m. that should be. Are we ready to go? Draco nodded decisively. It was all very rushed, but he'd long since been taught how to rush. Then go, said Harry Potter, and yanked off his cowled cloak and shoved it into his pouch, which began eating it, and, without even waiting for his pouch to finish, spun around and began striding rapidly toward the classroom door, bumping into a desk and almost falling over in his haste. By the time Draco had managed to get his own cloak off and stow it in his book bag, Harry Potter was gone. Draco almost ran out the door. 23. Belief in belief. And then Janet was a squib, said the portrait of a short young woman with a gold-trimmed hat. Draco wrote it down. That was only 28, but it was time to go back and meet Harry. He needed to ask other portraits to help translating. English had changed a lot, but the oldest portraits had described first-year spells that sounded an awful lot like the ones they had now. Draco had recognized around half of them, and the other half didn't sound any more powerful. The sick feeling in his stomach had grown with each answer until finally, unable to take it any more, he'd gone off and asked other portraits Harry Potter's strange question about squib marriages instead. The first 5 portraits hadn't known anyone, and finally he'd asked those portraits to ask their acquaintances, and so managed to find some people who'd actually admit to being friends with squibs. The first-year Slytherin had explained he was working on an important project with a Ravenclaw, and the Ravenclaw had told him they needed this information and then run off, without saying why. This had garnered many sympathetic looks. Draco's feet were heavy as he walked through the corridors of Hogwarts. He should have been running, but he couldn't seem to muster the energy. He kept on thinking that he didn't want to know about this. He didn't want to be involved in any of this. He didn't want this to be his responsibility. Just let Harry Potter do it. If magic was fading, let Harry Potter take care of it. But Draco knew that wasn't right. Chill the dungeons of Slytherin, gray the stone walls. Draco usually liked the atmosphere, but now it seemed too much like fading. His hand on the doorknob, Harry Potter already inside and waiting, wearing his cowled cloak. The ancient first-year spells, Harry Potter said. What did you find? They're no more powerful than the spells we use now. Harry Potter's fist struck a desk, hard. Damn it. All right. My own experiment was a failure, Draco. There's something called the interdict of Merlin Dash. Draco hit himself on the forehead, realizing, which stops anyone from getting knowledge of powerful spells out of books. Even if you find and read a powerful wizard's notes, they won't make sense to you. It has to go from one living mind to another. I couldn't find any powerful spells that we had the instructions for, but couldn't cast. But if you can't get them out of old books, why would anyone bother passing them on by word of mouth after they stopped working? Did you get the data on the squib couples? Draco started to hand the parchment over, but Harry Potter held up a hand. Law of science, Draco. First I tell you the theory and the prediction. Then you show me the data. That way you know I'm not just making up a theory to fit. You know that the theory actually predicted the data in advance. I have to explain this to you anyway, so I have to explain it before you show me the data. That's the rule. So put on your cloak and let's sit down. Harry Potter sat down at a desk with torn scraps of paper arranged across its surface. Draco drew his cloak out of his book bag, drew it on, and sat down across from Harry on the other side, giving the paper scraps a puzzled look. They were arranged in 2 rows, and the rows were about 20 scraps long. The secret of blood, said Harry Potter, an intense look on his face, is something called deoxyribonucleic acid. You don't say that name in front of anyone who's not a scientist. Deoxyribonucleic acid is the recipe that tells your body how to grow 2 legs, 2 arms, short or tall, whether you have brown eyes or green. It's a material thing. You can see it if you have microscopes, which are like telescopes, only they look at things that are very small instead of very far away. And that recipe has 2 copies of everything always, in case one copy is broken. Imagine 2 long rows of pieces of paper. At each place in the row, there are 2 pieces of paper, and when you have children, your body selects 1 piece of paper at random from each place in the row, and the mother's body will do the same, and so the child also gets 2 pieces of paper at each place in the row. 2 copies of everything, 1 from your mother, 1 from your father, and when you have children, they get 1 piece of paper from you at random in each place. As Harry spoke, his fingers ranged over the paired scraps of paper, pointing to one part of the pair when he said, from your mother, the other when he said, from your father. And as Harry talked about picking a piece of paper at random, his hand pulled a canute out of his robes and flipped it. Harry looked at the coin and then pointed to the top piece of paper, all without a pause in the speech. Now, when it comes to something like being short or tall, there's a lot of places in the recipe that make little differences. So if a tall father marries a short mother, the child gets some pieces of paper saying tall and some pieces of paper saying short, and usually the child ends up middle-sized. But not always. By luck, the child might get a lot of pieces saying tall, and not many papers saying short, and grow up pretty tall. You could have a tall father with 5 papers saying tall and a tall mother with 5 papers saying tall, and by amazing luck the child gets all 10 papers saying tall and ends up taller than both of them.
You see? Blood
Isn't a perfect fluid. It doesn't mix perfectly. Deoxyribonucleic acid is made up of lots of little pieces, like a glass of pebbles instead of a glass of water. That's why a child isn't always exactly in the middle of the parents. Draco listened with his mouth open. How in Merlin's name had the Muggles figured all this out? They could see the recipe? Now, Harry Potter said, suppose that, just like with tallness, there's lots of little places in the recipe where you can have a piece of paper that says magic or not magic. If you have enough pieces of paper saying magic, you're a wizard. If you have a lot of pieces of paper, you're a powerful wizard. If you have too few, you're a muggle, and in between, you're a squib. Then, when 2 squibs marry, most of the time the children should also be squibs, but once in a while a child will get lucky and get most of the father's magic papers and most of the mother's magic papers, and be strong enough to be a wizard. But probably not a very powerful one. If you started out with a lot of powerful wizards and they married only each other, they would stay powerful. But if they started marrying Muggleborns who were just barely magical or squibs, you see? The blood wouldn't mix perfectly. It would be a glass of pebbles, not a glass of water, because that's just the way blood works. There would still be powerful wizards now and then when they got a lot of magic papers by luck. But they wouldn't be as powerful as the most powerful wizards from earlier. Draco nodded slowly. He'd never heard it explained that way before. There was a surprising beauty to how exactly it fit. But, Harry said, that's only one hypothesis. Suppose that instead there's only a single place in the recipe that makes you a wizard. Only one place where a piece of paper can say magic or not magic. And there are 2 copies of everything always. So then there are only 3 possibilities. Both copies can say magic. One copy can say magic and one copy can say not magic. Or both copies can say not magic. Wizards, squibs, and muggles. 2 copies and you can cast spells. 1 copy and you can still use potions or magic devices. And 0 copies means you might even have trouble looking straight at magic. Muggleborns wouldn't really be born to muggles. They would be born to 2 squibs, 2 parents each with 1 magic copy who'd grown up in the muggle world. Now imagine a witch marries a squib. Each child will get 1 paper saying magic from the mother, always. It doesn't matter which piece gets picked at random. Both say magic. But like flipping a coin, half the time the child will get a paper saying magic from the father, and half the time the child will get the father's paper saying not magic. When a witch marries a squib, the result won't be a lot of weak wizarding children. Half the children will be wizards and witches just as powerful as their mother, and half the children will be squibs. Because if there's just 1 place in the recipe that makes you a wizard, then magic isn't like a glass of pebbles that can mix. It's like a single magical pebble, a sorcerer's stone. Harry arranged 3 pairs of papers side by side. On 1 pair he wrote magic and magic. On another pair he wrote magic on the top paper only. And the 3rd pair he left blank. In which case, Harry said, either you have 2 stones or you don't. Either you're a wizard or not. Powerful wizards would get that way by studying harder and practicing more. And if wizards get inherently less powerful, not because of spells being lost, but because people can't cast them, then maybe they're eating the wrong foods or something. But if it's gotten steadily worse over 800 years, then that could mean magic itself is fading out of the world. Harry arranged another 2 pairs of papers side by side and took out a quill. Soon each pair had one piece of paper saying magic and the other paper blank. "And that brings me to the prediction," said Harry. "What happens when 2 squibs marry? Flip a coin twice. It can come up heads and heads, heads and tails, tails and heads, or tails and tails. So 1/4 of the time you'll get 2 heads, 1/4 of the time you'll get 2 tails, and half the time you'll get 1 heads and 1 tail. Same thing if 2 squibs marry. 1/4 of the children would come up magic and be wizards. 1/4 would come up not magic and be muggles. The other half would be squibs. It's a very old and very classic pattern. It was discovered by Gregor Mendel, who is not forgotten, and it was the first hint ever uncovered for how the recipe worked. Anyone who knows anything about blood science would recognize that pattern in an instant. It wouldn't be exact any more than if you flip a coin twice 40 times, you'll always get exactly 10 pairs of 2 heads. But if it's 7 or 13 wizards out of 40 children, that'll be a strong indicator. That's the test I had you do. Now let's see your data." And before Draco could even think, Harry Potter had taken the parchment out of Draco's hand. Draco's throat was very dry. 28 children. He wasn't sure of the exact number, but he was pretty sure around a fourth had been wizards. 6 wizards out of 28 children, Harry Potter said after a moment. "Well, that's that, then. And first years were casting the same spells at the same power level 8 centuries ago. 2. Your test and my test both came out the same way." There was a long silence in the classroom. "What now?" Draco whispered. He'd never been so terrified. "It's not definite yet," said Harry Potter. "My experiment failed, remember? I need you to design another test, Draco." Draco said. His voice was breaking. "I can't do this, Harry. It's too much for me." Harry's look was fierce. "Yes, you can, because you have to. I thought about it myself, too, after I found out about the interdict of Merlin. Draco, is there any way of observing the strength of magic directly? Some way that doesn't have anything to do with wizard's blood or the spells we learn?" Draco's mind was just blank. "Anything that affects magic affects wizards," said Harry. "But then we can't tell if it's the wizards or the magic. What does magic affect that isn't a wizard?" "Magical creatures, obviously," said Draco, without even thinking about it. Harry Potter slowly smiled. "Draco, that's brilliant. It's the sort of dumb question you'd only ask in the first place if you'd been raised by muggles." Then the sickness in Draco's stomach got even worse as he realized what it would mean if magical creatures were getting weaker. They would know for certain then that magic was fading, and there was a part of Draco that was already sure that was exactly what they would find. He didn't want to see this. He didn't want to know. Harry Potter was already halfway to the door. "Come on, Draco. There's a portrait not far from here. We'll just ask them to go get someone old and find out right away. We're cloaked. If someone sees us, we can just run away. Let's go." It didn't take long after that. It was a wide portrait, but the 3 people in it were looking rather crowded. There was a middle-aged man from the 12th century, dressed in black swathes of cloth, who spoke to a sad-looking young woman from the 14th century, with hair that seemed to constantly frizz about her head as if she'd been charged up by a static spell, and she spoke to a dignified, wizened old man from the 17th century with a solid gold bow tie, and him they could understand. They had asked about dementors. They had asked about phoenixes. They had asked about dragons and trolls and house elves. Harry had frowned, pointed out that creatures which needed the most magic could just be dying out entirely, and had asked for the most powerful magical creatures known. There wasn't anything unfamiliar on the list, except for a species of dark creature called mind flayers, which the translator noted had finally been exterminated by Harold Shea, and those didn't sound half as scary as Dementus. Magical creatures were as powerful now as they'd ever been, apparently. The sickness in Draco's stomach was easing, and now he just felt confused. "Harry," Draco said in the middle of the old man translating a list of all 11 powers of a beholder's eyes, "what does this mean?" Harry held up a finger, and the old man finished the list. Then Harry thanked all the portraits for helping. Draco, pretty much on automatic, did so as well and more graciously, and they headed back to the classroom. And Harry brought out the original parchment with the hypotheses and began scribbling. Observation: wizardry isn't as powerful now as it was when Hogwarts was founded. Hypotheses: 1. Magic itself is fading. 2. Wizards are interbreeding with muggles and squibs. 3. Knowledge to cast powerful spells is being lost. 4. Wizards are eating the wrong foods as children, or something else besides blood is making them grow up weaker. 5. Muggle technology is interfering with magic. Since 800 years ago. 6. Stronger wizards are having fewer children. Draco equals only child. Check if 3 powerful wizards, Quirrell/Dumbledore/Dark Lord, had any children.
Tests.
A. Are there spells we know but can't cast, 1 or 2? Or are the lost spells no longer known, 3? Result: inconclusive due to interdict of Merlin. No known uncastable spell, but could simply have not been passed on. B. Did ancient first-year students cast the same sort of spells, with the same power as now? Weak evidence for 1/2, but blood could also be losing powerful wizardry only. Result: same level of first-year spells then as now. See additional test that distinguishes 1 and 2 using scientific knowledge of blood. We'll explain later. Result: there's only one place in the recipe that makes you a wizard, and either you have 2 papers saying magic or you don't. D. Are magical creatures losing their powers? Distinguishes 1 from 2 or 3. Result: magical creatures seem to be as strong as they ever were. A. Failed, said Harry Potter. B is weak evidence for 1/2. C falsifies 2. D falsifies 1. 4 was unlikely, and B argues against 4 as well. 5 was unlikely, and D argues against it. 6 is falsified along with 2. That leaves 3. Interdict of Merlin or not, I didn't actually find any known spell that couldn't be cast. So when you add it all up, it looks like knowledge is being lost. And the trap snapped shut. As soon as the panic went away, as soon as Draco understood that magic wasn't fading out, it took all of 5 seconds to realize. Draco shoved himself away from the desk and stood up so hard that his chair skittered with a scraping noise across the floor and fell over. So, it was all just a stupid trick, then. Harry Potter stared at him for a moment, still sitting. When he spoke, his voice was quiet. It was a fair test, Draco. If it had come out a different way, I would have accepted it. That's not something I would ever cheat on. Ever. I didn't look at your data before I made my predictions. I told you up front when the interdict of Merlin invalidated the first experiment dash. Oh, Draco said, the anger starting to come out into his voice. You didn't know how the whole thing was going to come out? I didn't know anything you didn't know, Harry said, still quietly. I admit that I suspected. Hermione Granger was too powerful. She should have been barely magical, and she wasn't. How can a Muggle-born be the best spellcaster in Hogwarts? And she's getting the best grades on her essays, too. It's too much coincidence for one girl to be the strongest magically and academically, unless there's a single cause. Hermione Granger's existence pointed to there being only one thing that makes you a wizard, something you either have or you don't, and the power differences coming from how much we know and how much we practice. And there weren't different classes for purebloods and Muggleborns and so on. There were too many ways the world didn't look the way it would look if you were right. But Draco, I didn't see anything you couldn't see too. I didn't perform any tests I didn't tell you about. I didn't cheat, Draco. I wanted us to work out the answer together. And I never thought that magic might be fading out of the world until you said it. It was a scary idea for me, too. Whatever, Draco said. He was working very hard to control his voice and not just start screaming at Harry. You claim you're not going to run off and tell anyone else about this. Not without consulting you first, Harry said. He opened his hands in a pleading gesture. Draco, I'm being as nice as I can, but the world turned out to just not be that way.
Fine.
Then you and I are through. I'm going to just walk away and forget any of this ever happened. Draco spun around, feeling the burning sensation in his throat, the sense of betrayal, and that was when he realized he really had liked Harry Potter, and that thought didn't slow him down for a moment as he strode toward the classroom door. And Harry Potter's voice came, now louder and worried. Draco, you can't forget. Don't you understand? That was your sacrifice. Draco stopped in mid-stride and turned around. What are you talking about? But there was already a freezing coldness in Draco's spine. He knew even before Harry Potter said it. To become a scientist. You questioned one of your beliefs, not just a small belief, but something that had great significance to you. You did experiments, gathered data, and the outcome proved the belief was wrong. You saw the results and understood what they meant. Harry Potter's voice was faltering. Remember, Draco, you can't sacrifice a true belief that way, because the experiments will confirm it instead of falsifying it. Your sacrifice to become a scientist was your false belief that wizard blood was mixing and getting weaker. That's not true, said Draco. I didn't sacrifice the belief. I still believe that. His voice was getting louder, and the chill was getting worse. Harry Potter shook his head. His voice came in a whisper. Draco. I'm sorry, Draco. You don't believe it, not anymore. Harry's voice rose again. I'll prove it to you. Imagine that someone tells you they're keeping a dragon in their house. You tell them you want to see it. They say it's an invisible dragon. You say fine, you'll listen to it move. They say it's an inaudible dragon. You say you'll throw some cooking flour into the air and see the outline of the dragon. They say the dragon is permeable to flour. And the telling thing is that they know, in advance, exactly which experimental results they'll have to explain away. They know everything will come out the way it does if there's no dragon. They know in advance just which excuses they'll have to make. So maybe they say there's a dragon. Maybe they believe there's a dragon. It's called belief in belief. but they don't actually believe it. You can be mistaken about what you believe. Most people never realize there's a difference between believing something and thinking it's good to believe it. Harry Potter had risen from the desk now and taken a few steps toward Draco. And Draco, you don't believe any more in blood purism. I'll show you that you don't. If blood purism is true, then Hermione Granger doesn't make sense. So, what could explain her? Maybe she's a wizarding orphan raised by muggles, just like I was? I could go to Granger and ask to see pictures of her parents, to see if she looks like them. Would you expect her to look different? Should we go perform that test? They would have put her with relatives, Draco said, his voice trembling. They'll still look the same.
You see.
You already know what experimental result you'll have to excuse. If you still believed in blood purism, you would say, sure, let's go take a look. I bet she won't look like her parents. She's too powerful to be a real muggle-born dash. They would have put her with relatives. Scientists can do tests to check for sure if someone is the true child of a father. Granger would probably do it if I paid her family enough. She wouldn't be afraid of the results. So, what do you expect that test to show? Tell me to run it, and we will. But you already know what the test will say.
You'll always know.
You won't ever be able to forget. You might wish you believed in blood purism, but you'll always expect to see happen just exactly what would happen if there was only one thing that made you a wizard. That was your sacrifice to become a scientist. Draco's breathing was ragged. Do you realize what you've done? Draco surged forward, and he seized Harry by the collar of his robes. His voice rose to a scream. It sounded unbearably loud in the closed classroom and the silence. Do you realize what you've done? Harry's voice was shaky. You had a belief. The belief was false. I helped you see that. What's true is already so. Owning up to it doesn't make it worse, Dash. The fingers on Draco's right hand clenched into a fist, and that hand dropped down and blasted up unstoppably and punched Harry Potter in the jaw so hard that his body went crashing back into a desk and then to the floor. "Idiot!" screamed Draco. "Idiot! Idiot!" "Draco!" whispered Harry from the floor. "Draco, I'm sorry. I didn't think this would happen for months. I didn't expect you to awaken as a scientist this quickly. I thought I would have longer to prepare you, teach you the techniques that make it hurt less to admit you're wrong, Dash." "What about fathers?" Draco said. His voice trembled with rage. "Were you going to prepare him, or did you just not care what happened after this?" "You can't tell him," Harry said, his voice rising in alarm. "He's not a scientist." "You promised, Draco." For a moment, the thought of father not knowing came as a relief. And then the real anger started to rise. "So you planned for me to lie to him and tell him I still believe," Draco said, voice shaking. "I'll always have to lie to him. And now when I grow up, I can't be a Death Eater, and I won't even be able to tell him why not." "If your father really loves you," whispered Harry from the floor, "he'll still love you even if you don't become a Death Eater. And it sounds like your father does really love you, Draco Dash." "Your stepfather is a scientist," Draco said, the words coming out like biting knives. "If you weren't going to be a scientist, he would still love you. But you'd be a little less special to him." Harry flinched. The boy opened his mouth, as if to say, "I'm sorry," and then closed his mouth, seeming to think better of it, which was either very smart of him or very lucky, because Draco might have tried to kill him. "You should have warned me," Draco said. His voice rose. "You should have warned me." I did. Every time I told you about the power, I told you about the price. I said, you have to admit you're wrong. I said this would be the hardest path for you, that this was the sacrifice anyone had to make to become a scientist. I said, what if the experiment says one thing and your family and friends say another dash? You call that a warning? Draco was screaming now. You call that a warning? When we're doing a ritual that calls for a permanent sacrifice.
I.
The boy on the floor swallowed. I guess maybe it wasn't clear.
I'm sorry.
But that which can be destroyed by the truth should be. Hitting him wasn't enough. You're wrong about one thing, Draco said, his voice deadly. Granger isn't the strongest student in Hogwarts. She just gets the best grades in class. You're about to find out the difference. Sudden shock showed in Harry's face, and he tried to roll quickly to his feet. It was already too late for him. Expelliarmus. Harry's wand flew across the room. Gom Jabbar. A pulse of inky blackness struck Harry's left hand. That's a torture spell, said Draco. It's for getting information out of people. I'm just going to leave it on you and lock the door behind me when I go. Maybe I'll set the locking spell to wear off after a few hours. Maybe it won't wear off until you die in here. Have fun. Draco moved smoothly backward, wand still on Harry. Draco's hand dipped down, picked up his book bag, without his aim wavering. The pain was already showing in Harry Potter's face as he spoke. Malfoys are above the underage magic laws, I take it? It's not because your blood is stronger. It's because you already practiced. In the beginning you were as weak as any of us. Is my prediction wrong? Draco's hand whitened on his wand, but his aim stayed steady. Just so you know, Harry said through gritted teeth, if you told me I was wrong, I would have listened. I won't ever torture you when you show me that I'm wrong. And you will. Someday. You're awakened as a scientist now, and even if you never learn to use your power, you'll always, Harry gasped, be looking for ways to test your beliefs. Draco's backing away was less smooth, now a little faster, and he had to work to keep his wand on Harry as he reached back to open the door and step back out of the classroom. Then Draco shut the door again. He cast the most powerful locking charm he knew. Draco waited until he heard Harry's first scream before casting the quietus. And then he walked away. Finite incantum. Harry's left hand had been put into a pot of boiling cooking oil and left there. He'd put everything he had into the finite incantum, and it still wasn't working. Some hexes required specific counters, or you couldn't undo them, or maybe it was just that Draco was that much stronger. Harry's hand was really starting to hurt now, and that was interfering with his attempts to think creatively. But a few screams later, Harry realized what he had to do. His pouch, unfortunately, was on the wrong side of his body, and it took some twisting to reach into it, especially with his other arm flailing around in a reflex, unstoppable attempt to fling off the source of pain. By the time he managed it, his other arm had managed to throw away his wand again. Medical kit. On the floor, the green light was too dim to see by. Harry couldn't stand. He couldn't crawl. He rolled across the floor to where he thought his wand was, and it wasn't there, and with one hand he managed to raise himself high enough to see his wand, and he rolled there and got the wand, and rolled back to where the medical kit was opened. There was also a good deal of screaming and a bit of throwing up. It took 8 tries before Harry could cast Lumos. And then, well, The package wasn't designed to be opened one-handed, because all wizards were idiots, that was why. Harry had to use his teeth, and so it took a while before Harry finally managed to wrap the numbcloth over his left hand. When all feeling in his left hand was finally gone, Harry let his mind come apart and lay motionless on the floor and cried for a while. Well, Harry's mind said silently into itself when it had recovered enough to think in words again. Was it worth it? Slowly, Harry's functional hand reached up to a desk. Harry pulled himself to his feet, took a deep breath, exhaled, smiled. It wasn't much of a smile, but it was a smile nonetheless. Thank you, Professor Quirrell. I couldn't have lost without you. He hadn't redeemed Draco yet, not even close. Contrary to what Draco himself might now believe, Draco was still the child of a Death Eater, through and through. Still a boy who'd grown up thinking rape was something the cool older kids did. But it was one heck of a start. Harry couldn't claim it had all gone just as planned. It had all gone just as completely made up on the spot. The plan hadn't called for this to happen until December or thereabouts, after Harry had taught Draco the techniques not to deny the evidence when he saw it. But he'd seen the look of fear on Draco's face, realized that Draco was already taking an alternative hypothesis seriously, and seized the moment. One case of true curiosity had the same sort of redeeming power in rationality that one case of true love had in movies. In retrospect, Harry had given himself hours to make the most important discovery in the history of magic, and months to break through the undeveloped mental barriers of an 11-year-old boy. This could indicate that Harry had some sort of major cognitive deficit with respect to estimating task completion times. Was Harry going to science hell for what he'd done? Harry wasn't sure. He'd contrived to keep Draco's mind on the possibility that magic was fading, made sure Draco would carry out the part of the experiment that would seem at first to point in that direction. He'd waited until after explaining genetics to prompt Draco into realizing about magical creatures, though Harry had thought in terms of ancient artifacts like the Sorting Hat, which no one could duplicate anymore, but which continued to function. But Harry hadn't actually exaggerated any evidence, hadn't distorted the meaning of any results. When the interdict of Merlin had invalidated the test that should have been definitive, he told Draco up front. And then there was the part after that. But he hadn't actually lied to Draco. Draco had believed it, and that would make it true. The end, admittedly, had not been fun. Harry turned and staggered toward the door. Time to test Draco's locking spell. The first step was simply trying to turn the doorknob. Draco could have been bluffing. Draco hadn't been bluffing. Finite incantatem. Harry's voice came out rather hoarse, and he could feel that the spell hadn't taken. So Harry tried it again, and that time it felt true. But another twist at the doorknob showed it hadn't worked. No surprise there. Time to bring out the big guns. Harry drew a deep breath. This spell was one of the most powerful he'd learned so far. Alohomora. Harry staggered a little after saying it, and the classroom door still didn't open. That shocked Harry. Harry hadn't been planning to go anywhere near Dumbledore's forbidden corridor, of course. But a spell to open magical locks had seemed like a useful sort of spell anyway, and so Harry had learned it. Was Dumbledore's forbidden corridor meant to lure people so stupid that they didn't notice the security was worse than what Draco Malfoy could put on it? Fear was creeping back into Harry's system. The placard in the medical kit had said the numbcloth could only safely be used for up to 30 minutes. After that, it would come off automatically and not be reusable for 24 hours. Right now, it was 6:51 p.m. He'd put on the numb cloth about 5 minutes ago. So Harry took a step back and considered the door. It was a solid panel of dark oaken wood, interrupted only by the brass metal doorknob. Harry didn't know any explosive or cutting or smashing spells, and transfiguring explosive would have violated the rule against transfiguring things to be burned. Acid was a liquid and would have made fumes, but that was no obstacle to a creative thinker. Harry laid his wand against one of the door's brass hinges and concentrated on the form of cotton as a pure abstraction apart from any material cotton, and also on the pure material apart from the pattern that made it a brass hinge, and brought the two concepts together, imposing shape on substance. An hour of transfiguration practice every day for a month had gotten Harry to the point where he could transfigure a subject of 5 cubic centimeters in just under a minute. After 2 minutes, the hinge hadn't changed at all. Whoever had designed Draco's locking spell, they'd thought of that, too. Or the door was part of Hogwarts, and the castle was immune. A glance showed the walls to be solid stone. So was the floor. So was the ceiling. You couldn't separately transfigure a part of something that was a solid whole. Harry would have needed to try transfiguring the whole wall, which would have taken hours or maybe days of continuous effort, if he could have done it at all, and if the wall wasn't contiguous with the rest of the whole castle. Harry's time-turner wouldn't open until 9 p.m. After that, he could go back to 6 p.m. before the door was locked. How long would the torture spell last? Harry swallowed hard. Tears were coming into his eyes again. His brilliantly creative mind had just offered the ingenious suggestion that Harry could cut his hand off using the hacksaw in the tool set stored in his pouch, which would hurt, obviously, but might hurt a lot less than Draco's pain spell, since the nerves would be gone, and he had tourniquets in the healer's kit. And that was obviously a hideously stupid idea that Harry would regret the rest of his entire life. But Harry didn't know if he could hold out for 2 hours under torture. He wanted out of this classroom. He wanted out of this classroom now. He didn't want to wait in here screaming for 2 hours until he could use the time turner. He needed to get out and find someone to get the torture spell off his hand.
Think.
Harry screamed at his brain. Think.
Think.
The Slytherin dorm was mostly empty. People were at dinner. For some reason, Draco himself wasn't feeling very hungry. Draco closed the door to his private room, locked it, charmed it shut, quieted it, sat down on his bed, and started to cry. It wasn't fair. It wasn't fair. It was the first time Draco had ever really lost before. Father had warned him that losing for real would hurt the first time it happened, but he'd lost so much. It wasn't fair. It wasn't fair for him to lose everything the very first time he lost. Somewhere in the dungeons, a boy Draco had actually liked was screaming in pain. Draco had never hurt anyone he'd liked before. Punishing people who deserved it was supposed to be fun, but this just felt sick inside. Father hadn't warned him about that, and Draco wondered if it was a hard lesson everyone had to learn when they grew up, or if Draco was just weak. Draco wished it were Pansy screaming. That would have felt better. And the worst part was knowing that it might have been a mistake to hurt Harry Potter. Who else was there for Draco now? Dumbledore? After what he'd done, Draco would sooner have been burned alive. Draco would have to go back to Harry Potter because there was nowhere else for him to go. And if Harry Potter said he didn't want him, then Draco would be nothing, just a pathetic little boy who could never be a Death Eater, Never join Dumbledore's faction. Never learn science. The trap had been perfectly set, perfectly executed. Father had warned Draco over and over that what you sacrificed to dark rituals couldn't be regained. But Father hadn't known that the accursed Muggles had invented rituals that didn't need wands, rituals you could be tricked into doing without knowing it, and that was only one of the terrible secrets which scientists knew and which Harry Potter had brought with him. Draco started crying harder. Then. He didn't want this, but there was no turning back. It was too late. He was already a scientist. Draco knew he should go back and free Harry Potter and apologize. It would have been the smart thing to do. Instead, Draco stayed in his bed and sobbed. He'd already hurt Harry Potter. It might be the only time Draco ever got to hurt him, and he would have to hold to that one memory for the rest of his life. Let him keep screaming. Harry dropped the remnants of his hacksaw to the ground. The brass hinges had proved impervious, not even scratched, and Harry was beginning to suspect that even the desperation act of trying to transfigure acid or explosives would have failed to open this door. On the plus side, the attempt had destroyed the hacksaw. His watch said it was 7:02 p.m., with less than 15 minutes left, and Harry tried to remember if there were any other sharp things in his pouch that needed destroying, and felt another fit of tears welling up. If only, when his time-turner opened, he could go back and prevent. And that was when Harry realized he was being silly. It wasn't a first time he'd been locked in a room. Professor McGonagall had already told him the correct way to do this. She'd also told him not to use the time-turner for this sort of thing. Would Professor McGonagall realize that this occasion really did warrant a special exception? Or just take away the time-turner entirely? Harry gathered up all his things, all the evidence, into his pouch. A Scourgify took care of the vomit on the floor, though not the sweat that had soaked his robes. He left the overturned desks overturned. It wasn't important enough to be worth doing with one hand. When he was done, Harry glanced down at his watch. 7:04 p.m. And then Harry waited. Seconds passed, feeling like years. At 7:07 p.m., the door opened. Professor Flitwick's puff-bearded face looked rather concerned. "Are you all right, Harry?" said the squeaky voice of Ravenclaw's head of house. "I got a note saying you've been locked in here. 24. Machiavellian Intelligence Hypothesis." Draco waited in a small windowed alcove he'd found near the Great Hall, stomach churning. There would be a price, and it would not be small. Draco had known that as soon as he'd woken up and realized that he didn't dare enter the Great Hall for breakfast because he might see Harry Potter there, and Draco didn't know what would happen after that. Footsteps approached. "Here you go," said Vincent's voice. "Now the boss ain't in a good mood today, so you'd better watch your step." Draco was going to skin that idiot alive and send back the flayed body with a request for a more intelligent servant, like a dead gerbil. One set of footsteps went off, and the other set of footsteps came closer. The churning in Draco's stomach got worse. Harry Potter came into sight. His face was carefully neutral, but his blue-trimmed robes looked oddly askew, as if they hadn't been put on quite right. "Your hand," Draco said without thinking about it at all. Harry raised his left arm, as though to look at it himself. The hand dangled limply from it, like something dead. "Madame Pomfrey said it's not permanent," Harry said quietly. "She said it should mostly recover by the time classes start tomorrow." For a single instant the news came as a relief. And then Draco realized. "You went to Madame Pomfrey," whispered Draco. Of course I did, said Harry Potter, as though stating the obvious. My hand wasn't working. It was slowly dawning on Draco what an absolute fool he'd been, far worse than the older Slytherins he'd chewed out. He'd just taken for granted that no one would go to the authorities when a Malfoy did something to them, that no one would want Lucius Malfoy's eye on them ever. But Harry Potter wasn't a frightened little Hufflepuff trying to stay out of the game. He was already playing it, and Father's eye was already on him. What else did Madame Pomfrey say? Said Draco, his heart in his throat. Professor Flitwick said that the spell cast on my hand had been a dark torture hex and extremely serious business, and that refusing to say who did it was absolutely unacceptable. There was a long pause. And then, Draco said in a shaking voice. Harry Potter smiled slightly. I apologized deeply, which made Professor Flitwick look very stern, and then I told Professor Flitwick that the whole thing was, indeed, extremely serious, secret, delicate business, and that I'd already informed the headmaster about the project. Draco gasped.
No.
Flitwick isn't going to just accept that. He'll check with Dumbledore. Indeed, said Harry Potter. I was promptly hauled off to the headmaster's office. Draco was trembling now. If Dumbledore brought Harry Potter before the Wizengamot, willingly or otherwise, and had the boy who lived testify under Veritaserum that Draco had tortured him, too many people loved Harry Potter. Father could lose that vote. Father might be able to convince Dumbledore not to do that, but it would cost. Cost terribly. The game had rules now. You couldn't just threaten someone at random anymore. But Draco had walked into Dumbledore's hands of his own free will. And Draco was a very valuable hostage. Though since Draco couldn't be a Death Eater now, he wasn't as valuable as Father thought. The thought tore at his heart like a cutting charm. Then what? Whispered Draco. Dumbledore deduced immediately that it was you. He knew we'd been associating. The worst possible scenario. If Dumbledore hadn't guessed who did it, he might not have risked using legilimency just to find out. But if Dumbledore knew, and Draco forced out the word. We had a little chat. And Harry Potter grinned. And I explained that it would be in his best interest not to do anything. Draco's mind ran into a brick wall and splattered. He just stared at Harry Potter with his mouth hanging slack, like a fool. It took that long for Draco to remember. Harry knew Dumbledore's mysterious secret, the one Snape used as his hold. Draco could just see it now. Dumbledore looking all stern, concealing his eagerness as he explained to Harry what a terribly serious matter this was. And Harry politely telling Dumbledore to keep his mouth shut if he knew what was good for him. Father had warned Draco against people like this, people who could ruin you and still be so likable that it was hard to hate them properly. After which, Harry said, the headmaster told Professor Flitwick that this was, indeed, a secret and delicate matter of which he had already been informed, and that he did not think pressing it at this time would help me or anyone. Professor Flitwick started to say something about the headmaster's usual plotting going much too far, and I had to interrupt at that point and explain that it had been my own idea and not anything the headmaster forced me into. So Professor Flitwick spun around and started lecturing me, and the headmaster interrupted him and said that as the boy who lived, I was doomed to have weird and dangerous adventures, so I was safer if I got into them on purpose instead of waiting for them to happen by accident, And that was when Professor Flitwick threw up his little hands and started shrieking in a high-pitched voice at both of us about how he didn't care what we were cooking up together. But this wasn't ever to happen again for as long as I was in Ravenclaw House, or he would have me thrown out, and I could go to Gryffindor, which was where all this Dumbledoring belonged. Harry was making it very hard for Draco to hate him. Anyway, Harry said, I didn't want to be thrown out of Ravenclaw, so I promised Professor Flitwick that nothing like this would happen again, and if it did, I would just tell him who did it. Harry's eyes should have been cold. They weren't. The voice should have made it a deadly threat. It wasn't. And Draco saw the question that should have been obvious, and it killed the mood in an instant. Why didn't you? Harry walked over to the window, into the small beam of sunlight shining into the alcove, and turned his head outward, toward the green grounds of Hogwarts. The brightness shone on him, on his robes, on his face. Why didn't I? Harry said. His voice caught. I guess because I just couldn't get angry at you. I knew I'd hurt you first. I won't even call it fair, because what I did to you was worse than what you did to me. It was like running into another brick wall. Harry could have been speaking archaic Greek for all Draco understood him then. Draco's mind scrabbled for patterns and came up flat blank. The statement was a concession that hadn't been in Harry's best interests. It wasn't even what Harry should say to make Draco a more loyal servant, now that Harry held power over him. For that Harry should be emphasizing how kindly he'd been, not how much he'd hurt Draco. Even so, Harry said, and now his voice was lower, almost a whisper, please don't do that again, Draco. It hurt, and I'm not sure I could forgive you a second time. I'm not sure I'd be able to want to. Draco just didn't get it. Was Harry trying to be friends with him? There was no way Harry Potter could be dumb enough to believe that was still possible after what he'd done. You could be someone's friend and ally, like Draco had tried to do with Harry, or you could destroy their life and leave them no other options. Not both. But then Draco didn't understand what else Harry could be trying. And a strange thought came to Draco then, something Harry had kept talking about yesterday. And the thought was, test it. You're awakened as a scientist now, Harry had said, and even if you never learn to use your power, you'll always be looking for ways to test your beliefs. Those ominous words, spoken in gasps of agony, had kept running through Draco's mind. If Harry was pretending to be the repentant friend who had accidentally hurt someone. You planned what you did to me, Draco said, managing to put a note of accusation in his voice. You didn't do it because you got angry. You did it because you wanted to. Fool, Harry Potter would say. Of course I planned it, and now you're mine. Harry turned back toward Draco. What happened yesterday wasn't the plan, Harry said, his voice seeming stuck in his throat. The plan was that I would teach you why you were always better off knowing the truth, and then we would try together to discover the truth about blood, and whatever the answer was, we would accept it. Yesterday I rushed things. Always better off knowing the truth, Draco said coldly. Like you did me a favor. Harry nodded, blowing Draco's mind completely, and said, what if Lucius comes up with the same idea I did, that the problem is stronger wizards having fewer children? He might start a program to pay the strongest pure bloods to have more children. In fact, if blood purism were right, that's just what Lucius should be doing, addressing the problem on his side, where he can make things happen right away. Right now, Draco, you're the only friend Lucius has who would try to stop him from wasting the effort, because you're the only one who knows the real truth, and can predict the real results. The thought came to Draco that Harry Potter had been raised in a place so strange that he was now effectively a magical creature rather than a wizard. Draco simply couldn't guess what Harry would say or do next. "Why," Draco said. Putting pain and betrayal into his voice wasn't hard at all. "Why did you do this to me? What was your plan?" "Well," Harry said, "you're Lucius's heir, and believe it or not, Dumbledore thinks I belong to him. So we could grow up and fight their battles with each other. Or we could do something else." Slowly, Draco's mind wrapped around this. You want to provoke a fight to the finish between them, then seize power after they're both exhausted? Draco felt cold dread in his chest. He would have to try and stop that no matter the cost to himself. But Harry shook his head. "Stars above, no. No. You wouldn't go along with that, and neither would I," said Harry. "This is our world. We don't want to break it. But imagine, say, Lucius thought the conspiracy was your tool, and you were on his side. Dumbledore thought the conspiracy was my tool, and I was on his side. Lucius thought that you'd turn me, and Dumbledore believed the conspiracy was mine. Dumbledore thought that I'd turned you, and Lucius believed the conspiracy was yours, and so they both helped us out, but only in ways that the other one wouldn't notice." Draco did not have to fake being speechless. Father had once taken him to see a play called The Tragedy of Light, about this incredibly clever Slytherin named Light who'd set out to purify the world of evil using an ancient ring that could kill anyone whose name and face he knew, and who'd been opposed by another incredibly clever Slytherin, a villain named Lolliot, who'd worn a disguise to conceal his true face, and Draco had shouted and cheered at all the right parts, especially in the middle. And then the play had ended sadly, and Draco had been hugely disappointed, and Father had gently pointed out that the word tragedy was right there in the title. Afterward, Father had asked Draco if he understood why they had gone to see this play. Draco had said it was to teach him to be as cunning as Light and Lolliot when he grew up. Father had said that Draco couldn't possibly be more wrong, and pointed out that while Lolliot had cleverly concealed his face, there had been no good reason for him to tell Light his name. Father had then gone on to demolish almost every part of the play, while Draco listened with his eyes growing wider and wider. And Father had finished by saying that plays like this were always unrealistic, because if the playwright had known what someone actually as smart as Light would actually do, the playwright would have tried to take over the world himself instead of just writing plays about it. That was when Father had told Draco about the rule of 3, which was that any plot which required more than 3 different things to happen would never work in real life. Father had further explained that since only a fool would attempt a plot that was as complicated as possible, the real limit was 2. Draco couldn't even find words to describe the sheer gargantuan unworkability of Harry's master plan. But it was just the sort of mistake you would make if you didn't have any mentors and thought you were clever and had learned about plotting by watching plays. "So," said Harry, "what do you think of the plan?" "It's clever," Draco said slowly. Shouting "brilliant" and gasping in awe would have looked too suspicious. "Harry, can I ask a question?" "Sure," said Harry. "Why did you buy Granger an expensive pouch?" "To show no hard feelings," said Harry at once. "Though I expect she'll also feel awkward if she refuses any small requests I make over the next couple of months." And that was when Draco realized that Harry actually was trying to be his friend. Harry's move against Granger had been smart, maybe even brilliant. Make your enemy not suspect you, and put them into your debt in a friendly way so that you could maneuver them into position just by asking them. Draco couldn't have gotten away with that. His target would have been too suspicious. But the boy who lived could. So the first step of Harry's plot was to give his enemy an expensive present. Draco wouldn't have thought of that, but it could work. If you were Harry's enemy, his plots might be hard to see through at first. They might even be stupid, but his reasoning would make sense once you understood it. You would comprehend that he was trying to hurt you. The way Harry was acting toward Draco right now did not make sense. Because if you were Harry's friend, then he tried to be friends with you in the alien, incomprehensible way he'd been raised by Muggles to do, even if it meant destroying your entire life. The silence stretched. I know that I've abused our friendship terribly, Harry said finally. But please realize, Draco, that in the end, I just wanted the two of us to find the truth together. Is that something you can forgive? A fork with two paths, but with only one path easy to go back on later if Draco changed his mind. I guess I understand what you were trying to do, Draco lied. So yes. Harry's eyes lit up. I'm glad to hear that, Draco, he said softly. The two students stood in that alcove. Harry still dipped in the lone sunbeam, Draco in shadow. And Draco realized with a note of horror and despair that although it was a terrifying fate indeed to be Harry's friend, Harry now had so many different avenues for threatening Draco that being his enemy would be even worse.
Probably.
Maybe. Well, he could always switch to being enemies later. He was doomed. So, Draco said, Now what? We study again next Saturdays? It better not go like the last one, Dash. Don't worry, it won't, said Harry. A few more Saturdays like that, and you'd be ahead of me. Harry laughed. Draco didn't. Oh, and before you go, Harry said, and grinned sheepishly. I know this is a bad time, but I want to ask you for advice about something, actually. Okay, Draco said, still a bit distracted by that last statement. Harry's eyes grew intent. Buying that pouch for Granger used up most of the gold I managed to steal from my Gringotts vault, Dash.
What?
And McGonagall has the vault key? Or Dumbledore does now, maybe. And I was just about to launch a plot that might take some money, so I was wondering if you know how I can get access, Dash. I'll loan you the money, said Draco's mouth in sheer existential reflex. Harry looked taken aback, but in a pleased way. Draco, you don't have to, Dash. How much? Harry named the amount, and Draco couldn't quite keep the shock from showing on his face. That was almost all the spending money Father had given Draco to last out the whole year. Draco would be left with just a few galleons. Then Draco mentally kicked himself. All he had to do was write Father and explain that the money was gone because he had managed to loan it to Harry Potter, and Father would send him a special congratulatory note written in golden ink, a giant chocolate frog that would take 2 weeks to eat, and 10 times as many galleons, just in case Harry Potter needed another loan. It's way too much, isn't it? Said Harry. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have asked, Dash. Excuse me, I am a Malfoy, you know, said Draco. I was just surprised you wanted that much. Don't worry, Harry Potter said cheerfully. It's nothing that threatens your family's interests, just me being evil. Draco nodded.
No problem then.
You want to go get it right now?
Sure, said Harry.
As they left the alcove and started heading toward the dungeons, Draco couldn't help but ask, so can you tell me which plot this is for? Rita Skeeter. Draco thought some very bad words to himself, but it was far too late to say no. By the time they'd reached the dungeons, Draco had started pulling together his thoughts again. He was having trouble hating Harry Potter. Harry had been trying to be friendly. He was just insane. And that wasn't going to stop Draco's revenge, or even slow it down. So, Draco said, after looking around to make certain no one was nearby. Their voices would both be blurred, of course, but it never hurt to be extra sure. I've been thinking, when we bring new recruits into the conspiracy, they're going to have to think we're equals. Otherwise, it would only take one of them to blow the plot to Father. You already worked that out, right? Naturally, said Harry. Will we be equals? Said Draco. I'm afraid not, Harry said. It was clear that he was trying to sound gentle, and also clear that he was trying to suppress a good deal of condescension, and not quite succeeding. I'm sorry, Draco, but you don't even know what the word Bayesian in Bayesian conspiracy means right now. You're going to have to study for months before we take anyone else in just so you can put up a good front. Because I don't know enough science, Draco said, carefully keeping his voice neutral. Harry shook his head at that. The problem isn't that you're ignorant of specific science things like deoxyribonucleic acid. That wouldn't stop you from being my equal. The problem is that you aren't trained in the methods of rationality, the deeper secret knowledge behind how all those discoveries got made in the first place. I'll try to teach you those, but they're a lot harder to learn. Think of what we did yesterday, Draco. Yes, you did some of the work, but I was the only one in control. You answered some of the questions. I asked all of them. You helped push. I did the steering by myself. And without the methods of rationality, Draco, you can't possibly steer the conspiracy where it needs to go. I see, said Draco, his voice sounding disappointed. Harry's voice tried to gentle itself even more. I'll try to respect your expertise, Draco, about things like people stuff. But you need to respect my expertise too, and there's just no way you could be my equal when it comes to steering the conspiracy. You've only been a scientist for one day, you know one secret about deoxyribonucleic acid, and you aren't trained in any of the methods of rationality. I understand, said Draco. And he did. People stuff, Harry had said. Seizing control of the conspiracy probably wouldn't even be difficult. And afterward, he would kill Harry Potter just to be sure. The memory rose up in Draco of how sick inside it had felt last night, knowing Harry was screaming. Draco thought some more bad words. Fine. He wouldn't kill Harry. Harry had been raised by Muggles. It wasn't his fault he was insane. Instead, Harry would live on, just so that Draco could tell him that it had all been for Harry's own good. Really, he ought to be grateful. And with a sudden twitch of surprised pleasure, Draco realized that it actually was for Harry's own good. If Harry tried to carry out his plan of playing Dumbledore and Father for Fools, he would die. That made it perfect. Draco would take all of Harry's dreams away from him, just as Harry had done to him. Draco would tell Harry that it had been for his own good, and it would be absolutely true. Draco would wield the conspiracy and the power of science to purify the wizarding world, and Father would be as proud of him as if he'd been a Death Eater. Harry Potter's evil plots would be foiled, and the forces of right would prevail. The perfect revenge. Unless, just pretend to be pretending to be a scientist, Harry had told him. Draco didn't have words to describe exactly what was wrong with Harry's mind, since Draco had never heard the term depth of recursion. But he could guess what sort of plots it implied. Unless all that was exactly what Harry wanted Draco to do, as part of some even larger plot which Draco would play right into by trying to foil this one. Harry might even know that his plan was unworkable. It might have no purpose except luring Draco to thwart it.
No.
That way lay madness. There had to be a limit. The Dark Lord himself hadn't been that twisty. That sort of thing didn't happen in real life. Only in Father's silly bedtime stories about foolish gargoyles who always ended up furthering the hero's plans every time they tried to stop him. And beside Draco, Harry walked along with a smile on his face, thinking about the evolutionary origins of human intelligence. In the beginning, before people had quite understood how evolution worked, they'd gone around thinking crazy ideas like human intelligence evolved so that we could invent better tools. The reason why this was crazy was that only one person in the tribe had to invent a tool, and then everyone else would use it, and it would spread to other tribes and still be used by their descendants 100 years later. That was great from the perspective of scientific progress, but in evolutionary terms, it meant that the person who invented something didn't have much of a fitness advantage, didn't have all that many more children than everyone else. Only relative fitness advantages could increase the relative frequency of a gene in the population and drive some lonely mutation to the point where it was universal and everyone had it. And brilliant inventions just weren't common enough to provide the sort of consistent selection pressure it took to promote a mutation. It was a natural guess if you looked at humans with their guns and tanks and nuclear weapons and compared them to chimpanzees, that the intelligence was there to make the technology. A natural guess, but wrong. Before people had quite understood how evolution worked, they'd gone around thinking crazy ideas like the climate changed, and tribes had to migrate, and people had to become smarter in order to solve all the novel problems. But human beings had 4 times the brain size of a chimpanzee. 20% of a human's metabolic energy went into feeding the brain. Humans were ridiculously smarter than any other species. That sort of thing didn't happen because the environment stepped up the difficulty of its problems a little. Then the organisms would just get a little smarter to solve them. Ending up with that gigantic outsized brain must have taken some sort of runaway evolutionary process, something that would push and push without limits. And today's scientists had a pretty good guess at what that runaway evolutionary process had been. Harry had once read a famous book called Chimpanzee Politics. The book had described how an adult chimpanzee named Lut had confronted the aging alpha, Yeroen, with the help of a young, recently matured chimpanzee named Nikki. Nikki had not intervened directly in the fights between Lut and Yeroen, but had prevented Yeroen's other supporters in the tribe from coming to his aid, distracting them whenever a confrontation developed between Lut and Yeroen. And in time Lut had won, and become the new alpha, with Nikki as the second most powerful. Though it hadn't taken very long after that for Nikki to form an alliance with the defeated Yeroen, overthrow Lut, and become the new alpha. It really made you appreciate what millions of years of hominids trying to outweed each other, an evolutionary arms race without limit, had led to in the way of increased mental capacity. 'Cause, a human would have totally seen that one coming. And beside Harry, Draco walked along, suppressing his smile as he thought about his revenge. Someday, maybe in years, but someday Harry Potter would learn just what it meant to underestimate a Malfoy. Draco had awakened as a scientist in a single day. Harry had said that wasn't supposed to happen for months. But of course, if you were a Malfoy, you would be a more powerful scientist than anyone who wasn't. So Draco would learn all of Harry Potter's methods of rationality, and then when the time was ripe. 25. Hold off on proposing solutions. Act 2. The sun shone brilliantly into the great hall from the enchanted sky ceiling above, illuminating the students as though they sat beneath the naked sky, gleaming from their plates and bowls, as, refreshed by a night's sleep, they inhaled breakfast in preparation for whatever plans they'd made for their Sunday.
So,
There was only one thing that made you a wizard. That wasn't surprising when you thought about it. What DNA mostly did was tell ribosomes how to chain amino acids together into proteins. Conventional physics seemed quite capable of describing amino acids, and no matter how many amino acids you chained together, conventional physics said you would never, ever get magic out of it. And yet magic seemed to be hereditary, following DNA. Then that probably wasn't, because the DNA was chaining together non-magical amino acids into magical proteins. Rather, the key DNA sequence did not, of itself, give you your magic at all. Magic came from somewhere else. At the Ravenclaw table there was one boy who was staring off into space, as his right hand automatically spooned some unimportant food into his mouth from whatever was in front of him. You probably could have substituted a pile of dirt, and he wouldn't have noticed. And for some reason, the source of magic was paying attention to a particular DNA marker among individuals who were ordinary ape-descended humans in every other way. Actually, there were quite a lot of boys and girls staring off into space. It was the Ravenclaw table, after all. There were other lines of logic leading to the same conclusion. Complex machinery was always universal within a sexually reproducing species. If gene B relied on gene A, then A had to be useful on its own and rise to near universality in the gene pool on its own, before B would be useful often enough to confer a fitness advantage. Then once B was universal, you would get a variant A asterisk that relied on B, and then C that relied on A asterisk and B, then B asterisk that relied on C, until the whole machine would fall apart if you removed a single piece. But it all had to happen incrementally. Evolution never looked ahead. Evolution would never start promoting B in preparation for a becoming universal later. Evolution was the simple historical fact that, whichever organisms did in fact have the most children, their genes would in fact be more frequent in the next generation. So each piece of a complex machine had to become nearly universal before other pieces in the machine would evolve to depend on its presence. So complex, interdependent machinery, the powerful, sophisticated protein machines that drove life, was always universal within a sexually reproducing species, except for a small handful of non-interdependent variants that were being selected on at any given time, as further complexity was slowly laid down. It was why all human beings had the same underlying brain design, the same emotions, the same facial expressions wired up to those emotions. Those adaptations were complex, so they had to be universal. If magic had been like that, a big complex adaptation with lots of necessary genes, then a wizard mating with a muggle would have resulted in a child with only half those parts, and half the machine wouldn't do much. And so there would have been no muggle-borns ever. Even if all the pieces had individually gotten into the Muggle gene pool, they'd never reassemble all in one place to form a wizard. There hadn't been some genetically isolated valley of humans that had stumbled onto an evolutionary pathway leading to sophisticated magical sections of the brain. That complex genetic machinery, if wizards interbred with Muggles, would never have reassembled into Muggle-borns. So, however your genes made you a wizard, it wasn't by containing the blueprints for complicated machinery. That was the other reason Harry had guessed the Mendelian pattern would be there. If magical genes weren't complicated, why would there be more than one? And yet magic itself seemed pretty complicated. A door-locking spell would prevent the door from opening and prevent you from transfiguring the hinges and resist finite incantatem and allohamra. Many elements all pointing in the same direction. You could call that goal orientation, or in simpler language, purposefulness. There were only two known causes of purposeful complexity: natural selection, which produced things like butterflies, and intelligent engineering, which produced things like cars. Magic didn't seem like something that had self-replicated into existence. Spells were purposefully complicated, but not, like a butterfly, complicated for the purpose of making copies of themselves. Spells were complicated for the purpose of serving their user, like a car. Some intelligent engineer, then, had created the source of magic and told it to pay attention to a particular DNA marker. The obvious next thought was that this had something to do with Atlantis. Harry had asked Hermione about that earlier, on the train to Hogwarts, after hearing Draco say it, and so far as she knew, nothing more was known than the word itself. It might have been pure legend, but it was also plausible enough that a civilization of magic users, especially one from before the interdict of Merlin, would have managed to blow itself up. The line of reasoning continued. Atlantis had been an isolated civilization that had somehow brought into being the source of magic and told it to serve only people with the Atlantean genetic marker, the blood of Atlantis. And by similar logic, the words a wizard spoke, the wand movements, those weren't complicated enough of themselves to build up the spell effects from scratch, not the way that the 3 billion base pairs of human DNA actually were complicated enough to build a human body from scratch, not the way that computer programs took up thousands of bytes of data. So the words and wand movements were just triggers, levers pulled on some hidden and more complex machine. Buttons, not blueprints. And just like a computer program wouldn't compile if you made a single spelling error, the source of magic wouldn't respond to you unless you cast your spells in exactly the right way. The chain of logic was inexorable, and it led inevitably toward a single final conclusion. The ancient forebears of the wizards, thousands of years earlier, had told the source of magic to only levitate things if you said, Wingardium Leviosa. Harry slumped over at the breakfast table, resting his forehead wearily on his right hand. There was a story from the dawn days of artificial intelligence, back when they were just starting out, and no one had yet realized the problem would be difficult, about a professor who had delegated one of his grad students to solve the problem of computer vision. Harry was beginning to understand how that grad student must have felt. This could take a while. Why did it take more effort to cast the Allohamra spell if it was just like pressing a button? Who'd been silly enough to build in a spell for Avada Kedavra that could only be cast using hatred? Why did wordless transfiguration require you to make a complete mental separation between the concept of form and concept of material? Harry might not be done with this problem by the time he graduated Hogwarts. He could still be working on this problem when he was 30 years old. Hermione had been right. Harry hadn't realized that on a gut level before. He'd just given an inspiring speech about determination. Harry's mind briefly considered whether to get on a gut level that he might never solve the problem at all, then decided that would be taking things much too far. Besides, so long as he could get as far as immortality in the first few decades, he'd be fine. What method had the Dark Lord used? Come to think, The fact that the Dark Lord had somehow managed to survive the death of his first body was almost infinitely more important than the fact that he tried to take over magical Britain. "Excuse me," said an expected voice from behind him in very unexpected tones. "At your convenience, Mr. Malfoy requests the favor of a conversation." Harry did not choke on his breakfast cereal. Instead, he turned around and beheld Mr. Crabbe. "Excuse me," said Harry. "Don't you mean the boss wants to talk with yous?" Mr. Crabbe didn't look happy. "Mr. Malfoy instructed me to speak properly." "I can't hear you," Harry said. "You're not speaking properly." He turned back to his bowl of tiny blue crystal snowflakes and deliberately ate another spoonful. "The boss wants to talk with yous," came a threatening voice from behind him. "You'd better come see him, if you know what's good for ya."
There.
Now, everything was going according to plan. Act 1. "A reason," said the old wizard. He restrained the fury from his face. The boy before him had been the victim, and certainly did not need to be frightened any further. "There is nothing that can excuse Dash. What I did to him was worse." The old wizard stiffened in sudden horror. "Harry, what have you done?" "I tricked Draco into believing that I'd tricked him into participating in a ritual that sacrificed his belief in blood purism. And that meant he couldn't be a Death Eater when he grew up. He'd lost everything, Headmaster." There was a long quiet in the office, broken only by the tiny puffs and whistles of the fiddly things, which after enough time had come to seem like silence. "Dear me," said the old wizard, "I do feel silly. And here I was expecting you might try to redeem the heir of Malfoy by, say, showing him true friendship and kindness."
Ha!
"Yeah, like that would have worked." The old wizard sighed. This was taking it too far. "Tell me, Harry, did it even occur to you that there was something incongruous about setting out to redeem someone through lies and trickery?" "I did it without telling any direct lies, and since we're talking about Draco Malfoy here, I think the word you're looking for is congruous." The boy looked rather smug. The old wizard shook his head in despair. "And this is the hero. We're all doomed." Act 5. The long, narrow tunnel of rough stone, unlit except by a child's wand, seemed to stretch on for miles. The reason for this was simple. It did stretch on for miles. The time was 3 in the morning, and Fred and George were starting the long way down the secret passage that led from a statue of a one-eyed witch in Hogwarts to the cellar of the Honeyduke's candy shop in Hogsmeade. "How's it doing?" said Fred in a low voice. Not that there'd be anyone listening, but there was something odd about talking in a normal voice when you were going through a secret passage. "Still on the fritz," said George. "Both, or dash." Intermittent one fixed itself again. Other ones same as ever. The map was an extraordinarily powerful artifact, capable of tracking every sentient being on the school grounds, in real time, by name. Almost certainly, it had been created during the original raising of Hogwarts. It was not good that errors were starting to pop up. Chances were that no one except Dumbledore could fix it if it was broken. And the Weasley twins weren't about to turn the map over to Dumbledore. It would have been an unforgivable insult to the Marauders, the 4 unknowns who'd managed to steal part of the Hogwarts security system, something probably forged by Salazar Slytherin himself, and twisted into a tool for student pranking. Some might have considered it disrespectful. Some might have considered it criminal. The Weasley twins firmly believed that if Godric Gryffindor had been around to see it, he would have approved. The brothers walked on and on and on, mostly in silence. The Weasley twins talked to each other when they were thinking through new pranks, or when one of them knew something the other didn't. Otherwise, there wasn't much point. If they already knew the same information, they tended to think the same thoughts and make the same decisions. Back in the old days, whenever magical identical twins were born, it had been the custom to kill one of them after birth. In time, Fred and George clambered out into a dusty cellar, strewn with barrels and racks of strange ingredients. Fred and George waited. It wouldn't have been polite to do anything else. Before too long, a thin old man in black pajamas clambered down the steps that led into the cellar, yawning. "Hello, boys," said Ambrosius Flume. "I wasn't expecting you tonight. Out of stock already." Fred and George decided that Fred would speak. "Not exactly, Mr. Flume," said Fred. "We were hoping you could help us with something considerably more interesting." "Now, boys," said Flume, sounding severe, "I hope you didn't wake me up just so I could tell you again that I'm not selling you any merchandise that could get you into real trouble. Not until you're 16 anyways. George drew forth an item from his robes and wordlessly passed it to Flume. "Have you seen this?" said Fred. Flume looked at yesterday's edition of the Daily Prophet and nodded, scowling. The headline on the paper read, "The Next Dark Lord," and showed a young boy which some student's camera had managed to catch in an uncharacteristically cold and grim expression. "I can't believe that Malfoy," Flume snapped. "Going after the boy when he's only 11. The man ought to be ground up and used to make chocolates." Fred and George blinked in unison. Malfoy was behind Rita Skeeter? Harry Potter hadn't warned them about that, which surely meant that Harry didn't know. He never would have brought them in if he did. Fred and George exchanged glances. Well, Harry didn't need to know until after the job was done. "Mr. Flume," Fred said quietly, "the boy who lived needs your help." Flume looked at them both. Then he let out his breath with a sigh. "All right," said Flume. "What do you want?" Act 6. When Rita Skeeter was intent on a tasty prey, she didn't tend to notice the scurrying ants who constituted the rest of the universe, which was how she almost bumped into the balding young man who'd stepped into her pathway. "Miss Skeeter," said the man, sounding rather severe and cold for someone whose face looked that young. "Fancy running into you here." "Out of my way, Buster," snapped Rita, and tried to step around him. The man in her pathway matched the movement so perfectly that it was like neither of them had moved at all, just stood still while the street shifted around them. Rita's eyes narrowed. "Who do you think you are?" "How very foolish," the man said dryly. It would have been wise to memorize the face of the disguised Death Eater training Harry Potter to be the next Dark Lord. After all, a thin smile, that certainly sounds like someone you wouldn't want to run into on the street, especially after doing a hatchet job on him in the newspaper. Rita took a moment to place the reference. This was Quirinus Quirrell? He looked too young and too old at the same time. His face, if it relaxed from its severe and condescending pose, would belong to someone in his late 30s. And his hair was already falling out? Couldn't he afford a healer? No, that wasn't important. She had a time and a place and a beetle to be. She'd just received an anonymous tip about Madame Bones making time with one of her younger assistants. That would be worth quite a bonus if she could manage to verify it. Bones was high on the hit list. The tipster had said that Bones and her young assistant were due to eat lunch in a special room at Mary's place, a very popular room for certain purposes, A room which, she'd found, was secure against all listening devices, but not proof against a beautiful blue beetle nestled up against one wall. "Out of my way," Rita said, and tried to push Coral from her path. Coral's arm brushed her own, deflecting, and Rita staggered as the thrust went into the thin air. Coral pulled up the sleeve of his left robe, showing his left arm. "Observe," said Coral. "No dark mark. I would like your paper to publish a retraction." Rita let out an incredulous laugh. Of course the man wasn't a real Death Eater. The paper wouldn't have published it if he was. "Forget it, Buster. Now take a hike." Coral stared at her for a moment. Then he smiled. "Miss Skeeter," said Coral, "I had hoped to find some lever that would prove persuasive. Yet I find that I cannot deny myself the pleasure of simply crushing you. It's been tried. Now get out of my way, Buster, or I'll find some oars and have you arrested for obstruction of journalism." Coral swept her a small bow and then walked past. "Goodbye, Rita Skeeter," said his voice from behind her. As Rita buelled on ahead, she noted in the back of her mind that the man was whistling a tune as he walked away. Like that would scare her. Act 4. "Sorry, count me out," said Lee Jordan. "I'm more the giant spider type." The boy who lived had said that he had important work for the Order of Chaos, something serious and secret, more significant and difficult than their usual run of pranks. And then Harry Potter had launched into a speech that was inspiring, yet vague. A speech to the effect that Fred and George and Lee had tremendous potential if they could just learn to be weirder. To make people's lives surreal, instead of just surprising them with the equivalents of buckets of water propped above doors. Fred and George had exchanged interested looks. They'd never thought of that one. Harry Potter had invoked a picture of the prank they'd pulled on Neville, which Harry had mentioned with some remorse. The Sorting Hat had chewed him out on, but which must have made Neville doubt his own sanity. For Neville, it would have felt like being suddenly transported into an alternate universe. The same way everyone else had felt when they'd seen Snape apologize. That was the true power of pranking. "Are you with me?" Harry Potter had cried, and Lee Jordan had answered no. "Count us in," said Fred, or possibly George, for there was no doubt that Godric Gryffindor would have said yes. Lee Jordan gave a regretful grin and stood up and left the deserted and quieted corridor where the 4 members of the Order of Chaos had met and sat down in a conspiratorial circle. The 3 members of the Order of Chaos got down to business. It wasn't that sad. Fred and George would still work with Lee on giant spider pranks, same as ever. They'd only started calling it the Order of Chaos in order to recruit Harry Potter, after Ron had told them about Harry being weird and evil, and Fred and George had decided to save Harry by showing him true friendship and kindness. Thankfully, this no longer seemed necessary, although they weren't quite sure about that. "So," said one of the twins, "what's this about?" "Rita Skeeter," said Harry. "Do you know who she is?" Fred and George nodded, frowning. "She's been asking questions about me." That wasn't good news. "Can you guess what I want you to do?" Fred and George looked at each other, a bit puzzled. "You want us to slip her some of our more interesting candies?"
"No," said Harry.
No, no, no. That's giant spider thinking. Come on. What would you do if you heard that Rita Skeeter was looking for rumors about you? That made it obvious. Grins slowly started on the faces of Fred and George. "Start rumors about ourselves," they replied. "Exactly," said Harry, grinning widely. But these can't be just any rumors. I want to teach people never to believe what the newspaper says about Harry Potter, any more than Muggles believe what the newspaper says about Elvis. At first, I just thought about flooding Rita Skeeter with so many rumors that she wouldn't know what to believe, but then she'll just cherry-pick the ones that sound plausible and bad. So what I want you to do is create a fake story about me and get Rita Skeeter to believe it somehow. But it has to be something that afterward everyone will know was fake. We want to fool Rita Skeeter and her editors, and afterward have the proof come out that it was false. And, of course, given that those are the requirements, the story has to be as ridiculous as it can possibly be, and still get printed. Do you understand what I want you to do? Not exactly, Fred or George said slowly. You want us to invent the stories? I want you to do all of it, Harry Potter said. I'm sort of busy right now, plus I want to be able to say truthfully that I had no idea what was coming. Surprise me. For a moment there was a very evil grin on the faces of Fred and George. Then they turned serious. But Harry, we don't really know how to do anything like that, Dash. So figure it out, Harry said. I have confidence in you. Not total confidence, but if you can't do it, tell me that and I'll try someone else or do it myself. If you have a really good idea for both the ridiculous story and how to convince Rita Skeeter and her editors to print it, then you can go ahead and do it. But don't go with something mediocre. If you can't come up with something awesome, just say so. Fred and George exchanged worried glances. I can't think of anything, said George. Neither can I, said Fred. Sorry. Harry stared at them. And then Harry began to explain how you went about thinking of things. It had been known to take longer than 2 seconds, said Harry. You never called any question impossible, said Harry, until you had taken an actual clock and thought about it for 5 minutes by the motion of the minute hand. Not 5 minutes metaphorically, 5 minutes by a physical clock. And furthermore, Harry said, his voice emphatic and his right hand thumping hard on the floor, you did not start out immediately looking for solutions. Harry then launched into an explanation of a test done by someone named Norman Meyer, who was something called an organizational psychologist and who'd asked 2 different sets of problem-solving groups to tackle a problem. The problem, Harry said, had involved 3 employees doing 3 jobs. The junior employee wanted to just do the easiest job. The senior employee wanted to rotate between jobs to avoid boredom. An efficiency expert had recommended giving the junior person the easiest job and the senior person the hardest job, which would be 20% more productive. One set of problem-solving groups had been given the instruction, do not propose solutions until the problem has been discussed as thoroughly as possible without suggesting any. The other set of problem-solving groups had been given no instructions. And those people had done the natural thing and reacted to the presence of a problem by proposing solutions. And people had gotten attached to those solutions and started fighting about them and arguing about the relative importance of freedom versus efficiency and so on. The first set of problem-solving groups, the ones given instructions to discuss the problem first and then solve it, had been far more likely to hit upon the solution of letting the junior employee keep the easiest job and rotating the other 2 people between the other 2 jobs, for what the experts' data said would be a 19% improvement. Starting out by looking for solutions was taking things entirely out of order, like starting a meal with dessert, only bad. Harry also quoted someone named Robin Dawes as saying that the harder a problem was, the more likely people were to try to solve it immediately. So Harry was going to leave this problem to Fred and George, and they would discuss all the aspects of it and brainstorm anything they thought might be remotely relevant. And they shouldn't try to come up with an actual solution until they'd finished doing that, unless, of course, they did happen to randomly think of something awesome, in which case they could write it down for afterward and then go back to thinking. And he didn't want to hear back from them about any so-called failures to think of anything for at least a week. Some people spent decades trying to think of things. "Any questions?" said Harry. Fred and George stared at each other. "I can't think of any." "Neither can I." Harry coughed gently. "You didn't ask about your budget." "Budget?" they thought. "I could just tell you the amount," Harry said. "But I think this will be more inspiring." Harry's hands dipped into his robe and brought forth. Fred and George almost fell over, even though they were sitting down. "Don't spend it for the sake of spending it," Harry said. On the stone floor in front of them gleamed an absolutely ridiculous amount of money. "Only spend it if awesomeness requires, and what awesomeness does require, don't hesitate to spend. If there's anything left over, just return it afterward. I trust you. Oh, and you get 10% of what's there, regardless of how much you end up spending, Dash." "We can't," blurted one of the twins. "We don't accept money for that sort of thing." The twins never took money for doing anything illegal. Unknown to Ambrosius Flume, they were selling all of his merchandise at 0% markup. Fred and George wanted to be able to testify, under veritasrum if necessary, that they had not been profiteering criminals, just providing a public service. Harry frowned at them. "But I'm asking you to put in some real work here. A grown-up would get paid for doing something like this, and it would still count as a favor for a friend. You can't just hire people for this sort of thing." Fred and George shook their heads. "Fine," Harry said. "I'll just get you expensive Christmas presents, and if you try returning them to me, I'll burn them. Now you don't even know how much I'm going to spend on you, except, obviously, that it's going to be more than if you'd just taken the money. And I'm going to buy you those presents anyway, so think about that before you tell me you can't think of anything awesome." Harry stood up, smiling, and turned to go while Fred and George were still gaping in shock. He strode a few steps away and then turned back. "Oh, one last thing," Harry said. "Leave Professor Quirrell out of whatever you do. He doesn't like publicity. I know it'd be easier to get people to believe weird things about the defense professor than anyone else, and I'm sorry to have to get in your way like that. But please, leave Professor Quirrell out of it." And Harry turned again and took a few more steps, looked back one last time, and said, softly, "Thank you," and left. There was a long pause after he departed. "So," said one. "So," said the other. "The defense professor doesn't like publicity, does he? Harry doesn't know us very well, does he?" "No, he doesn't. But we won't use his money for that, of course." "Of course not. That wouldn't be right. We'll do the defense professor separately. We'll get some Gryffindors to write Skeeter and say..." His sleeve lifted up one time in defense class and they saw the dark mark, and he's probably teaching Harry Potter all sorts of dreadful things. And he's the worst defense professor anyone remembers, even in Hogwarts. He's not just failing to teach us, he's getting everything wrong, the complete opposite of what it should be. Like when he claimed that you could only cast the killing curse using love, which made it pretty much useless. I like that one. Thanks. I bet the defense professor likes it too. He does have a sense of humor. He wouldn't have called us what he did if he didn't have a sense of humor. But are we really going to be able to do Harry's jobs? Harry said to discuss the problem before trying to solve it. So let's do that. The Weasley twins decided that George would be the enthusiastic one while Fred doubted. "It all seems sort of contradictory," said Fred. "He wants it to be ridiculous enough that everyone laughs at Skeeter and knows it's wrong, and he wants Skeeter to believe it. We can't do both things at the same time." "We'll have to fake up some evidence to convince Skeeter," said George. "Was that a solution?" said Fred. "They considered this." "Maybe," said George, "but I don't think we should be all that strict about it, do you?" The twins shrugged helplessly. "So then the fake evidence has to be good enough to convince Skeeter," said Fred. "Can we really do that on our own?" "We don't have to do it on our own," said George, and pointed to the pile of money. "We can hire other people to help us." The twins got a thoughtful look on their face. "That could use up Harry's budget pretty fast," said Fred. "This is a lot of money for us, but it's not a lot of money for someone like Flume." "Maybe people will give discounts if they know it's for Harry," said George. "But most importantly of all, whatever we do, it has to be impossible." Fred blinked. "What do you mean, impossible?" "So impossible that we don't get in trouble because no one believes we could have done it. So impossible that even Harry starts wondering. It has to be surreal. It has to make people doubt their own sanity. It has to be better than Harry." Fred's eyes were wide in astonishment. This happened sometimes between them, but not often. But why? They were pranks. They were all pranks. The pie was a prank. The Remembrall was a prank. Kevin Entwistle's cat was a prank. Snape was a prank. We're the best pranksters in Hogwarts. Are we going to roll over and give up without a fight? "He's the boy who lived," said Fred. "And we're the Weasley twins. He's challenging us. He said we could do what he does. But I bet he doesn't think we'll ever be as good as him." "He's right," said Fred, feeling rather nervous. The Weasley twins did sometimes disagree even when they had all the same information, but every time they did it seemed unnatural, like at least one of them must be doing something wrong. This is Harry Potter we're talking about. He can do the impossible. We can't. "Yes, we can," said George. "And we have to be more impossible than him." "But said Fred. "It's what Godric Gryffindor would do," said George. That settled it, and the twins snapped back into whatever it was that was normal for them. "All right then, let's think about it." And that's a wrap for Part 5 of Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality. These chapters push the boundaries of what we thought we knew about the wizarding world, blending intellect, courage, and a touch of chaos into an unforgettable narrative. Did you know that Eliezer Yudkowsky, the mind behind Less Wrong, is a pioneer in the field of artificial intelligence research? His background in logic and cognitive science heavily influences the philosophical depth of this fanfiction. The fanfiction's concept of science-driven magic resonates with real-world quantum mechanics theories, where observation alters reality, a fitting analogy for the spells Harry analyzes in the story. Thank you for joining us in exploring this groundbreaking tale. As we gear up for Part 6, remember, every question answered opens the door to new mysteries. Don't forget to like, comment, and share your thoughts. And of course, hit that notification bell so you won't miss the next exciting chapters. Until next time, stay curious, stay magical, and remember, the greatest magic is the power of your own mind. See you soon.